He shoved the photograph across the counter like it was something that had crawled out of the gutter. "This is what they sent me," Caleb Whitaker said, loud enough for the two men nursing coffee at the far end of the diner to hear. "Supposed to be a bride. Looks more like another mouth I can't afford to feed." The postmaster, Gerald Finch, had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he didn't tell Caleb to lower his voice. Outside, 40 feet away, Evelyn Harper stood on the platform where the stage had just dropped her, holding a single travel bag and listening to every word through the open window. She had heard variations of this her entire life. She had learned not to let her face show what it did to her. But her hands were shaking. If that were you standing there in the Montana wind with nowhere to go back to, what would you do? If you've ever been judged before anyone bothered to learn your name, stay with me. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Harper arrived in Harlan Crossing, Montana, the temperature had not climbed above freezing since Tuesday, and the sky held the flat, pale color of old bone. She had been traveling for 11 days, train from Philadelphia to St. Louis, then another train west, then 2 days in a rattling stagecoach that smelled of leather and other people's misfortune. She was 31 years old. She had $42, a letter of introduction she had written herself, 3 dresses, and the kind of determination that forms in a person not from confidence but from having absolutely no other option. She had not eaten since the previous morning. She didn't mention it to anyone. The town of Harlan Crossing was smaller than the advertisement had suggested. Most towns were. The main street ran maybe 4 blocks before it gave up and dissolved into the pale grassland that stretched in every direction like something God had started and then abandoned. There was a general store, a livery, a diner with a cracked front window, a church whose paint was peeling badly, and a post office that also served as the telegraph office and, from the smell of it, occasionally as a place to store onions. Evelyn stood on the platform and took it all in. She had known, rationally, that this would not be Philadelphia. She had known it would be raw and rough and nothing like what she was accustomed to. She had prepared herself for the physical reality of frontier life. What she had not entirely prepared herself for was the specific kind of silence that fell over the small cluster of people on the platform when they saw her step down from the coach. That particular silence that meant people were making calculations about her before she had said a single word. She was a large woman. She had been a large woman since she was 14 years old, and she understood that this was the first thing most people saw when they looked at her, and that many of them never got around to looking at anything else. She had learned, over years, to let their assumptions become their problem rather than hers. It was an ongoing effort. It was never entirely finished. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the post office because that was where she had been told to go. She was halfway there when she heard the voice through the open window. "This is what they sent me." She stopped. Not because she was surprised, she had half expected something like this, but because hearing it spoken aloud in a public place, in that particular tone of casual contempt, did something to her breathing that she couldn't entirely control. She stood still for a moment. She listened to Gerald Finch say something she couldn't make out. She listened to Caleb Whitaker say, "I'm not saying she can't stay. I'm just saying this isn't what I had in mind." Evelyn took one slow breath. She adjusted her grip on her travel bag. She walked through the door of the post office. The two men looked at her. Gerald Finch went the color of old brick. Caleb Whitaker, tall, weathered, somewhere in his late 30s, with the look of a man who had been fighting something for so long he'd forgotten what winning felt like, went absolutely still. "Mr. Whitaker," Evelyn said. Her voice was level. She had practiced being level. "I'm Evelyn Harper. I believe you're expecting me." He said nothing for a moment. She watched him search for something appropriate and come up mostly empty. "Miss Harper," he finally managed. "The stage was on time," she said. "I understand that's unusual." Gerald Finch let out a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been a cough. Caleb Whitaker's jaw tightened. "My wagon's out front," he said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now," Evelyn said. She was not ready. She was exhausted and hungry, and her feet hurt, and she had just heard herself described as a burden by the man she was supposed to marry within the week. But she was not going to let any of that show in front of Gerald Finch or the two men at the counter who were now very obviously not looking at them. She followed Caleb Whitaker out into the cold. The ride to the Whitaker Ranch took 40 minutes. They did not speak for 35 of them. The land rolled and dipped in ways that were almost beautiful, Evelyn thought, if you were seeing it from a painting rather than a jolting wagon with a broken spring on the left side. She looked at the dried grass, the scattered stands of cottonwood, the occasional fencing that seemed to have given up trying to be straight. She looked at the sky, which was enormous and unforgiving and made her feel both very small and unexpectedly clear-headed. Caleb Whitaker drove with his eyes on the trail and his hands tight on the reins. He had the look, she decided, of a man who was angry at something he couldn't name, and so was angry at everything within reach. She had known men like that. They were usually afraid of something. "How bad is it?" she asked, at the 35-minute mark. He glanced at her sideways. "What?" "The ranch. How bad is it?" She had read his letter 3 times. She knew what was in it. She wanted to see if what came out of his mouth matched what he'd written down. His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "It's not great." The letter said debt to the Harlan Crossing First Bank. It said 3 consecutive poor harvests. It said you've had to let go of 3 of your 4 hands. She paused. How much of that is accurate and how much was to make it sound better than it is? Caleb Whitaker said nothing for a moment. All of it's accurate. And the rest? Another pause. The south pasture fence is mostly down. The well on the east side stopped producing last July. I've got 31 head of cattle when I should have close to 200, and the bank wants their first payment in... He stopped. In how long? Evelyn asked. 90 days. She absorbed this. How much? More than I have. She nodded. She looked back at the trail ahead. The wagon hit a rut, and she grabbed the sideboard and didn't make a sound about it. All right, she said. All right? He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. I didn't come here because I thought everything was fine, Evelyn said. I came because you needed help, and I needed... She paused, choosing the word carefully. A direction. So, all right. He stared at the trail for another long moment. You're not what I expected, he said finally. She looked at him steadily. I'm aware of what you expected, Mr. Whitaker. I heard you say it. The color that moved up his neck was not, she thought, entirely from the cold. The ranch house was 2 stories and had once been solid. You could see that in the bones of it, the way it sat on its foundation, the original workmanship of the porch posts, the stone chimney that still drew clean. But years of deferred maintenance had left their marks. The porch boards had soft spots. 2 windows on the upper floor were covered with oilcloth instead of glass. The barn, set back and to the left, listed slightly to one side in a way that suggested the next significant wind might settle the question permanently. The one remaining ranch hand, a man named Orrin Tibbs, who was somewhere between 50 and 100 and moved like both, came out of the barn when they pulled up. He took one look at Evelyn and pulled his hat off. Ma'am, he said. He had the manners of someone raised right, even if everything around him had gone to seed. Mr. Tibbs, Evelyn said. She had gotten his name from Caleb's letter, too. She noticed the brief surprise in his face at being named and filed it away. Inside, the house was cold and clean in the specific way that meant a man had cleaned it recently and with great effort and no particular expertise. The furniture was sparse and functional. There was a kitchen, a main room, and what would be her room off the side hallway. She had made this clear in her own letter, that she expected a separate room, at least until circumstances warranted otherwise. Caleb had agreed without comment. She set her bag down in the small room. She looked at the narrow bed, the single window, the hook on the wall for hanging clothes. She looked at it for exactly 5 seconds. Then she took off her traveling coat, rolled up her sleeves, and went back to the kitchen to see what was available. There was coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and half a sack of flour. There was also a cast-iron skillet that was in considerably better shape than most of the rest of the property, which told her something about what Caleb Whitaker had thought was worth caring for. She made coffee. She made biscuits with the flour and the salt pork. She didn't ask anyone's permission. By the time the coffee was done, she had also found a small ledger in the kitchen drawer and was examining its contents with the same focused attention she would have given a legal document. Caleb came through the kitchen and stopped when he saw the biscuits. You don't have to, he started. I know I don't have to, Evelyn said, without looking up from the ledger. Sit down and eat something. You look like you haven't had a real meal in a week. He sat down. He ate 2 biscuits before he said anything. The third he ate more slowly. That's the household ledger, he said. I can see that. She turned a page. Your feed costs are too high for the number of animals you're running. You're still paying the same rates you would have paid for a full herd. She looked up. Who's your supplier? Caleb blinked. Harmon's Feed over in Millbrook. Do they know your herd is down to 31 head? I didn't see the point in renegotiating. I figured it would go back up. When? He didn't answer. You've been running the costs of a full operation on the income of a failing one, Evelyn said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was direct. That's not a harvest problem, Mr. Whitaker. That's a math problem. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Part of it was something defensive. But underneath that, she thought, was something that might have been relief. The strange relief of having someone finally say out loud what he had known but been unable to face. You've done this before, he said. Books and figures. My father had a dry goods business, Evelyn said. I kept the accounts from the time I was 16. I also... She paused, deciding how much to give him. Read everything I could find on land management and agricultural economics, because I knew this was the direction I was heading and I intended to be useful when I got here. Caleb Whitaker set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look from the post office. Not the look that measured and found wanting, but something slower and more uncertain, like a man who has just realized he may have made an error in his initial accounting. The letter you sent, he said, the agency's version. It just said you were a capable woman from Philadelphia with domestic skills. That's accurate as far as it goes, Evelyn said. It left some things out. Most letters do. She did not sleep well her first night. The bed was narrow and the mattress was honest about its age, and through the thin walls she could hear the particular sounds of a house that was holding itself together through habit rather than intention. The creak and settle, the whisper of wind finding gaps. She lay in the dark and went through the numbers she had seen in the ledger. 90 days to the first payment. The amount she'd calculated from the interest figures was somewhere around $400. Not impossible, but close to it given current operations. The south pasture fence being down meant the grazing land wasn't being efficiently used. The dry east well meant she needed to look at water routing. The 31 head. She needed to see them, assess their condition, understand what they were actually working with. She was not afraid. This surprised her a little. She had expected fear, arriving in a strange place with a man who had already shown her what he thought of her, with a ranch that was bleeding out slowly and a deadline that wasn't moving. Instead, what she felt was something closer to clarity. The problem was visible. The variables were known. That was something to work with. What she felt fear about, quietly and privately, in the dark of that cold Montana room, was different. It was smaller and more personal, and she wasn't going to look directly at it yet. It was the question of whether this man, this tired, proud, disappointed man who had made no secret of his disappointment, could ever learn to see her as something other than a miscalculation. That was not a ledger problem. She didn't have a formula for that one. She thought about the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table while he ate the third biscuit. She thought about the almost involuntary quality of the look, like he was noticing something he hadn't expected to notice. It wasn't much, but she had learned over 31 years not to dismiss small things. She closed her eyes. She went through the ledger numbers again because they were something she could do something about. Eventually, somewhere in the figures, she found her way to sleep. The next morning, before Caleb was up, Evelyn dressed and went out to the barn. Orrin Tibbs was already there, forking hay with the slow precision of a man who had decided economy of movement was its own kind of dignity. He looked at her without surprise. She had the feeling not much surprised Orrin Tibbs. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Mr. Tibbs, I want to walk the property today. I want you to show me everything, the pastures, the fence line, the east well, the soil on the south acreage. I want to see it all." Orrin leaned on his fork. "Mr. Whitaker know you're planning to do that?" "He will," Evelyn said. "I'll tell him at breakfast." Orrin considered this for a moment with the patience of a man who had seen various kinds of management come and go. "You know much about ranch land?" "I know a fair amount about soil science and crop rotation," Evelyn said. "I've been reading about cattle range management for the past 8 months. I expect there's considerable I don't know yet. I also expect that I'll learn it." She met his eyes steadily. "I learned quickly, Mr. Tibbs. I want you to know that going in." Orrin Tibbs looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, something that was not quite respect yet, but was the thing that came just before it. "All right," he said. He set down his fork. "Let me finish with these two, and we'll start at the south fence." Caleb found them at the south pasture fence at 7:30, which was later than he'd intended to be awake, and considerably later than he'd expected his new arrival to be awake after 11 days of travel. He came over the rise on horseback and pulled up short when he saw Evelyn crouched at a fence post, turning the earth with a short-handled knife he didn't recognize, with Orrin standing beside her talking in the patient way he spoke to things he was showing for the first time. Caleb sat on his horse for a moment and watched. Evelyn stood, brushed her hands on her skirt in a single businesslike swipe, and said something to Orrin that made him nod. Then she looked up and saw Caleb on the ridge, and her face did not change, except that she raised one hand briefly in acknowledgement. He rode down. "You should have waited," he said when he reached them. He wasn't entirely sure what he meant by it. "You were still sleeping," Evelyn said. "The fence isn't going to wait. Neither is the soil." She held out the dirt-dusted knife toward him, then thought better of it, and kept it herself. "This section here, you see how it's dry clear down to 6 inches even after the last rain? This isn't just drought damage. You've got compaction. Something's been overgrazing this strip, pressing the moisture out. You put a fence down 8 feet that way," she pointed, "and let this section go fallow. You could have workable pasture here again in 18 months. Caleb looked at the ground, then at Evelyn, then at Orrin. "She's right about the compaction," Orrin said, with the neutrality of a man not choosing sides. Caleb looked back at Evelyn. She was watching him with that steady quality she had, that look of waiting without pressure, which he was starting to find either remarkable or infuriating and couldn't quite decide which. "Where did you learn soil science?" he said. "Books," Evelyn said. "And before you tell me that books aren't the same as experience, I know that. That's why I'm here looking at the actual ground." She paused. "I can tell you what I see and what I think it means. You can tell me where my reading matches the reality and where it doesn't. That seems like a better use of both our mornings than you riding out to supervise whether I can walk without assistance." The words were direct but not sharp. She said them like she was stating a preference, not throwing a challenge. Caleb sat on his horse for a moment and looked at this woman who had arrived 30 hours ago and was already standing in his south pasture, teaching him something about his own land. "All right," he said finally. He swung down from the horse. "Show me what else you found." Evelyn turned back toward the fence line, and if there was any satisfaction in her face, she kept it to herself. By the end of the first week, the town of Harlan Crossing had formed its opinions, as small towns do, quickly and without much investment in accuracy. The consensus at Harmon's Feed was that Caleb Whitaker had gotten himself a managing kind of woman, which, depending on who was talking, was either a pity or exactly what he deserved. Margaret Torrey, who ran the diner, said she seemed sharp enough, but that sharp women in struggling situations often caused more disruption than solutions. Roy Candler, who owned the bank and held Caleb's note, heard the news of Evelyn's arrival with the mild interest of a man watching a drowning swimmer try a new stroke. Curious, but not expecting a different outcome. The Reverend's wife said she'd heard the bride was heavy-set, which in her telling was a fact that somehow explained everything else. None of them had spoken to Evelyn. None of them had asked Caleb how the first week had gone. None of them knew that Evelyn had already renegotiated the feed contract by mail, identified 3 sections of the property that could support a kitchen garden before spring, mapped the route from the East Well location to a natural spring she'd found referenced in a 15-year-old surveyor's report she'd located in the bottom of a trunk in the barn, or spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table going through every piece of paper related to the ranch's finances, while Caleb sat across from her and answered questions he'd been avoiding for 2 years. None of them knew any of that. But Caleb did. He didn't know what to do with it. He'd spent a week waiting to feel crowded, waiting for the resentment that he expected to come with having someone in his house, in his business, in his plans. It kept not coming, or when it started to come, she would say something or do something that cut it off before it finished arriving. Like the morning she'd come in from the barn with mud on her boots and a splinter in her left palm that she was trying to extract herself with a needle. And he'd taken the needle from her without asking and done it himself. And she'd held very still and not made a sound. And when it was done, she'd looked up at him and said simply, "Thank you," and gone back to whatever she'd been doing. Or the evening she'd laughed, actually laughed, a real sound, not the polite kind, at something Orrin had said at supper, and he'd realized it was the first genuine laughter he'd heard in that kitchen in a very long time. He wasn't softening toward her. He was too careful a man to call it that. He was, perhaps, revising his initial calculation. The letter from Roy Candler at the bank arrived on a Thursday. Evelyn was the one who went to collect the mail, because she had established a habit of morning errands that took her through town and gave her the opportunity to observe things: the prices at the general store, which she was tracking, the state of other properties she could see from the main road, the general economic weather of Harlan Crossing. She brought the letter back without opening it, set it in front of Caleb at lunch, and waited. Caleb opened it. He read it once. He set it down. "He's moved the date up," he said. His voice was flat in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. "First payment due in 45 days instead of 90. Evelyn picked up the letter. She read it herself carefully, line by line. Roy Candler had cited a clause in the original loan agreement. She found it referenced in the letter, a clause she had not seen because she had not yet seen the original loan document, that allowed the bank to accelerate the payment schedule if, in the bank's assessment, the property value had declined significantly. He had assessed the property. He had found it lacking. "Has he been out here?" she said. "Not that I know of." Caleb's jaw was tight. "But he has friends." Evelyn reread the paragraph about the property assessment. Something in the phrasing was off. Too precise in some ways, too vague in others. It had the quality of language that had been written to sound official without being technically specific. "I need to see the original loan document," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to read the actual clause he's citing," Evelyn said. "And because when someone accelerates a debt payment on a legal technicality, they are usually either within their rights to do so, or they are hoping you won't know enough to find out that they aren't." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the back room and came back with a document he clearly hadn't looked at in some time. He set it on the table. Evelyn began to read. The kitchen was silent except for the wind outside and the sound of pages turning. Caleb watched her face. She read slowly, with a focused quality that reminded him, oddly, of the way he watched the sky before a storm, looking for something specific, alert to any shift in what she was seeing. After 20 minutes, she stopped. She put her finger on a paragraph near the bottom of the third page. "Read this," she said. He leaned over and read it. "The acceleration clause requires written notice to be delivered no less than 60 days prior to the new payment date," Evelyn said. "This letter is dated 8 days ago. Even if we received it today, that's not 60 days. Caleb stared at the paragraph. "He's not within his rights," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but a controlled, focused heat that was more dangerous than anger. "He's counting on you not knowing that." Caleb straightened up slowly. He looked at the letter. He looked at Evelyn. "Who are you?" he said. And this time, unlike the first time he'd seen her on the platform in the cold, it wasn't a disappointed question. It was something else entirely. Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm the woman you married," she said, "or close enough to it, and we have work to do." The letter from Roy Candler sat on the kitchen table between them, like something that had died there. Caleb read the clause a second time, then a third, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less damning on repeated inspection. They didn't. The 60-day notice requirement was clear, and Roy Candler's letter had been dated 8 days ago, which meant that even accounting for delivery time, he had missed his own legal threshold by more than 7 weeks. "He made a mistake," Caleb said. He didn't sound relieved. He sounded like a man trying to decide whether a snake he'd found in his barn was dead or just still. "He made a choice," Evelyn said. "Whether it was a mistake depends on whether he thought you'd notice." Caleb pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Outside, Orrin was moving between the barn and the water trough with his usual unhurried precision, and the sky had the low gray look of a sky that was considering its options. Caleb watched without seeing any of it. "Roy Candler has been in this county for 30 years, he said. "His father helped found the bank. He's called in loans on half the small ranches between here and Millbrook, and nobody's stopped him yet." "Nobody read the documents," Evelyn said. "That's not—" He stopped, turned from the window. It's not just about the documents. He's got relationships with every judge in 100 miles. He's got friends in the land office, friends at the county assessor. When he decides he wants a piece of land, he finds a way to get it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Is that what this is? He wants the land? Caleb was quiet for a moment. The Whitaker property sits on the only reliable water access for about 4 miles in any direction. There's a spring on the north edge that feeds into Lander Creek. Anyone who owns this property controls the water for a significant stretch of the valley. He paused. Roy's been acquiring land around us for about 3 years, small purchases, one at a time. The Morrison place, the Aldrich parcel, the eastern section of what used to be the Henley farm. Evelyn turned this over. She looked at the loan document again, then at the letter, then at the window where Caleb was still half turned, watching the yard. How long have you known that? She asked. Suspected, he said. Not known. How long have you suspected? A pause. About 18 months. And in 18 months you didn't go back and read your loan document. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was something more uncomfortable than that. The flat observation of a fact that implicated him in his own situation. Caleb's jaw worked. I had a ranch to run, he said, or try to run. I know, Evelyn said, and her voice softened by 1 degree, which was enough. I'm not saying it to blame you. I'm saying it because we need to understand exactly where we stand, and that means understanding what you knew and when and what you did with it. She set the loan document down. We need to respond to this letter, in writing, citing the specific clause, and we need to do it before he tries the next move. Caleb looked at her. You think there's a next move? I think a man who has been systematically acquiring land around a specific property for 3 years doesn't make one attempt and stop, Evelyn said. Don't you? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Evelyn wrote the response letter that afternoon. She wrote it at the kitchen table with the loan document beside her and a cup of coffee that went cold before she was halfway done. She wrote it once, read it back, crossed out 2 sentences that were too pointed in a way that might give Roy Candler something to work with, and rewrote them in language that was precise without being combative. She was not interested in making an enemy. She was interested in making a record. Caleb read it over her shoulder when she was done. That's, he started. Legal language, she said, or close enough. We cite the clause, we establish that the notice period was not met. We state that we consider the original payment timeline binding, and we request written confirmation of his understanding. She paused. We also make a copy before we send it. Where did you learn to write like this? Evelyn picked up her coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. My father had a dispute with a supplier when I was 22. It went on for 2 years. I watched every letter that was written. I watched what worked and what didn't. She looked up at him. You learn a great deal about how people use language when you watch them use it against someone you care about. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. If we send this and he decides to push back, through the courts, through whatever connections he has, we don't have the money to fight a legal battle. I know that, Evelyn said, which is why this letter is only step 1. He sat down across from her. This had become, over the past week, something that happened naturally now. Him sitting across the table from her in the evenings, the lamp between them, the business of the ranch spread out in documents and figures and questions. Neither of them had commented on it. What's step 2? He asked. Step 2 is that I need to understand everything about this property that isn't in the financial records, she said. The water rights, the grazing rights. What agreements, verbal or written, have ever been made with neighboring properties? What the surveyor's records actually show versus what the county assessor's records show. She folded her hands on the table. Because if Roy Candler has been preparing for this for 3 years, there may be things in those records that have been adjusted. Caleb stared at her. You think he's altered county records? I think that a man with 30 years of relationships in local government who has been deliberately acquiring land around a single property might have been very careful about what the official record of that property looks like. She paused. I could be wrong. I want to find out before assuming I'm right. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. Caleb looked at the letter, at the loan document, at the woman sitting across from him with her cold coffee and her careful language and her mind that moved like water, finding its way around obstacles. I need you to tell me something honestly, he said. She waited. Do you think we can actually... He stopped, rebuilt the sentence. Do you think there's a real way out of this, or are you working very hard at something that isn't going to change the end of the story? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She did not give him false comfort. I was a man who would have known the difference. I think the land is better than you've been treating it, she said finally. I think the situation has more options in it than you can see right now, partly because you've been too close to the fear of losing it to look at it clearly. And I think Roy Candler made at least one procedural error that buys us time. She paused. What I can't promise you is that time will be enough, but I'd rather fight for something real than accept a loss that someone manufactured for us. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't softness exactly. It was more like the expression a man makes when he has been carrying something heavy alone for a long time, and someone has just, without asking, put their hand to the other side of it. All right, he said. He said it the same way she had said it on the wagon ride from town, their first day. She recognized the weight of the words. The letter was delivered to Roy Candler's office at the bank on a Friday morning. Evelyn sent Orrin with it because she wanted someone reliable and unintimidating, the latter being a quality Roy Candler probably felt comfortable underestimating. Orrin delivered it, obtained a written receipt of delivery from the clerk, and came back with the receipt tucked in his breast pocket. He read it while I was still there, Orrin said, handing Evelyn the receipt across the kitchen table. His face didn't change, but he told the clerk to file it in the correspondence drawer instead of the active loan file. Did you see which drawer the clerk put it in? Evelyn asked. Orrin looked at her with the slight upward shift of expression that passed, for him, as a smile. Active loan file. Evelyn nodded. She looked at the receipt. Good. Caleb, who had been mending harness in the doorway, looked up. What does it mean that he tried to put it in the correspondence drawer? It means he'd prefer this exchange to look informal rather than official, Evelyn said. Correspondence is general records. Active loan file is the legal record of the debt. She folded the receipt and put it with the copy of her letter. He's going to try something else. And when he does, I want us to have the cleanest possible paper record of what's already happened. She was right about something else coming. It came on a Tuesday, in the form of a man named Decker. Decker arrived at the ranch in a good coat and a manner that was professionally friendly, which was its own kind of warning. He said he was a land assessor working on behalf of a regional agricultural investment group, and that his group had been looking at properties in the valley with interest and wondered if the Whitakers had ever considered selling. He said this to Caleb. He was careful not to look at Evelyn while he said it. Caleb started to answer, and Evelyn said pleasantly, "Who did you say you represent?" Decker turned to her with the slight recalibration that men in his position made when they realized they'd misread a room. A regional investment group. We prefer to maintain some privacy during the early stages of... What's the group's registered name? Evelyn asked. A small pause. I'm not at liberty to... Because if you're making a formal inquiry about a property, you're required to disclose the principal party on whose behalf you're acting, Evelyn said. She said it the same way she said most things, without heat, without volume. That's county regulation. I'm sure you know that. Decker's pleasant manner developed a slight crease. This is an informal inquiry. Then I'm afraid we're not interested in informal inquiries, Evelyn said. If your group would like to make a formal offer, in writing, with full disclosure of the principal party, we'd be happy to review it. She smiled, and it was a real smile, which somehow made it more final than if she had frowned. Thank you for riding out. After Decker left, Caleb watched the dust settle behind his horse for a long moment. Roy sent him, Caleb said. Almost certainly, Evelyn said. He wanted to know if we'd sell voluntarily before he tried the legal pressure again. She turned back toward the house. We just told him no without giving him any information about our position. That's useful. Caleb followed her inside. How is telling him no useful? Because now he knows we're not going to be easy, Evelyn said. That changes his timeline. Men who are used to easy wins get impatient when they don't get one quickly. She picked up the copy of her letter again, not because she needed to read it, but because holding it helped her think. An impatient man makes mistakes. Caleb looked at her. You're playing a longer game than I thought. I'm trying to, she said. I'd appreciate it if you'd trust me on some of this, even when I can't explain every step in advance. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you want me to trust a woman I've known for 11 days. 12, Evelyn said. And I want you to trust the logic, not just the woman, which means I need you to ask me when you don't understand something and argue with me when you think I'm wrong, and not simply defer to me because it's easier. She set the letter down. I'm not always right. I need you checking my work. Caleb looked at her with the specific expression she was starting to recognize, the one that happened when she said something he hadn't anticipated from the direction of expecting it. That's not what I expected you to say, he said. What did you expect? Something more. He paused. Certain. Certainty is usually someone trying to sell you something, Evelyn said. I'm not selling, I'm working. She moved toward the kitchen. Are you hungry? Because I found what I believe are the ingredients for a passable beef stew, and I'd like your opinion on whether the dried onions in that tin are still worth using or whether Oren should just take them out behind the barn. Caleb stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at her disappearing into the kitchen and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite hope. Hope was too large a word for where they were, but was maybe the precursor to it. The condition that hope required before it was willing to show up. 2 weeks after Evelyn's letter, Roy Candler came himself. He was a solid man in his early 60s, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He drove out in a covered buggy, which in itself was a statement. He wasn't riding out as a neighbor checking in. He was arriving as the man who held the paper on this place. Caleb saw the buggy coming from the north pasture, where he and Evelyn had been assessing the soil conditions on a stretch she thought could be converted to a productive kitchen and feed garden within one growing season. He straightened up. His expression went careful in a way Evelyn had come to recognize as his version of bracing. Stay here, he said, not unkindly. I'd rather come with you, Evelyn said. I know. He looked at her. But I need to talk to him man to man first. Just wait. She did not like this. She also recognized that Caleb needed this, needed to face Roy Candler on his own ground, in his own right, without the implication that his wife was managing him. She understood the importance of that to a man like Caleb, even if she didn't feel the importance herself. She stayed. She stayed, and she watched from a distance. She was careful to make look casual as Caleb walked down to meet Roy Candler's buggy. She couldn't hear what was said. She could see the body language, Candler's expansive, settled quality, the posture of a man who was comfortable with the amount of space he was taking up. Caleb's, which was tighter, more contained, but holding its ground. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. When Roy Candler drove away, Caleb walked back up to where Evelyn was standing with the deliberate, measured pace of a man keeping something internal under control. He said the letter was noted, Caleb said. He said he'd consulted with his attorney about the notice clause, and that there's precedent in Montana case law for, I don't remember his exact language, for emergency acceleration under certain conditions of property deterioration. Evelyn thought about this. Did he cite the specific cases? No. Did he provide anything in writing? No. He said his attorney would be following up. All right, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. He also said, he stopped. What? His jaw tightened. He said that he'd heard I'd been involved in the business side of things, and that he understood it could be difficult for a man in my position, starting over, and that if I needed to discuss options that would be fair to both parties, he was open to a private conversation. He stopped again. Just the two of us. He was clear about that. Evelyn absorbed this. He's trying to separate us, she said. I know what he's doing. What did you say? Caleb looked at her with an expression that was still careful, but had something different behind it now. I said that my wife handles the business correspondence, and that any offer or discussion would go through her. He paused. And then I said I had work to do. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had done something and was not entirely sure how it would land. Thank you, she said. Simple. No elaboration. He nodded once, and they went back to looking at the soil. The attorney's follow-up letter arrived the following week. Evelyn read it 3 times, sitting alone at the kitchen table after supper while Caleb did the evening check on the animals. The letter was longer than Roy Candler's first communication and considerably more technical. It cited 2 Montana precedents for emergency acceleration. It included language about the bank's fiduciary responsibility to its investors. It was, in short, the kind of letter that was designed to look definitive in order to make the recipient feel that any further resistance was futile. Evelyn made notes in the margin with a pencil. She looked up the two-sided cases in the legal reference volume she had purchased in Philadelphia, specifically because she had known, going into this situation, that legal documentation would matter. It had taken 3 weeks to acquire the book, and she had paid for it herself with money she could not entirely spare. And she had not told Caleb this because it was not information he needed to have. It was just something she had done. The first-cited case was not quite what the attorney had represented it to be. The emergency acceleration it had validated was for a property that had been abandoned. The owners had left the state, made no payments, and made no communication with the bank for 11 months. That was considerably different from a property with an active owner who had responded in writing to the notice within days of receiving it and was current on all scheduled payments. The second case was closer, but it had been decided in 1887, and there had been a subsequent ruling in 1891 that had modified the threshold for what constituted sufficient property deterioration to trigger the emergency clause. The attorney had cited the 1887 case. He had not mentioned the 1891 ruling. Evelyn sat back. She did not allow herself to feel triumphant. Triumph was premature, and it was also a distraction. What she felt was the focused, cold clarity of someone who has just seen exactly where the other person's argument is weak and is deciding what to do about that information. She was still sitting at the table when Caleb came in from outside. He looked at her face and stopped. "What did you find?" he said. "Sit down," she said. "I need to walk you through something." He sat. She explained. She showed him the margin notes, explained the discrepancy between the cited cases and their actual content, and laid out what she believed the attorney's letter was and was not technically accurate about. She did it carefully because she needed him to understand it, not just to hear her conclusion. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Can you write a response to this?" I can write a response," Evelyn said, "but I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you before I do." She looked at him directly. "We can fight this letter and we will probably win the immediate argument, but Roy Candler will find another angle. He has the money and the connections to keep coming at this from different directions for as long as it takes." She paused. "Which means that fighting letters is not enough. We have to also fix the ranch." Caleb looked at the letter. "I know that." "I know you know it," Evelyn said, "but I want to make sure we're clear that these are both happening at the same time. I'm not going to spend all my time on documents and none of it on the land, because winning the legal fight on a ranch that's still failing doesn't save us." She leaned forward slightly. "I have some ideas about what we can do with the North Pasture before winter closes in, and I've been corresponding with a man in Billings who has done some interesting work with drought-resistant feed crops. I want to talk to you about that. Tonight, if we're not both too tired." Caleb looked at her. She was aware that she had just laid out, in the space of about 2 minutes, a legal analysis, a strategic assessment, and a pivot to agricultural planning, and that she had done it not to impress him, but because it was what the situation required. "You're not too tired," he said. "I'm exhausted," Evelyn said honestly. "But this won't keep." He almost smiled. It was very close. He caught it before it arrived and turned it into the rough breath that men use when they don't want to be seen to be moved by something. "Tell me about the North Pasture," he said. Well, the weeks that followed were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not crisis-shaped, but the grinding, relentless work of trying to turn something around with insufficient resources and a clock that didn't care about effort. Evelyn was up before dawn most mornings. She had renegotiated the feed contract, cutting their monthly outlay by nearly a third. She had located a buyer in Great Falls for premium dried beef, who was willing to pay considerably more than the local rates, conditional on quality standards she was confident they could meet. She had written 3 letters about the 1891 ruling and the deficiencies in Roy Candler's attorney's argument, and the last of the 3 had produced a response suggesting the bank was consulting further before proceeding, which was not victory, but it was the silence of a man reconsidering his position. She had also, in the margins of all this, begun the actual physical work of the ranch alongside Caleb and Orrin. This was not what any of them had expected, including Evelyn herself. She had expected to be useful in the ways she had prepared for: the figures, the strategy, the correspondence. She had not entirely expected to find herself one cold October morning helping Orrin reset a fence post in ground that had partially frozen overnight, or 2 days later helping Caleb carry feed when the routine of the operation required more hands than they had. She was not naturally suited to physical labor in the way that Caleb was, in the way that the ranch demanded. Her body was strong but differently built, and there were things that took her twice as long and left her aching in ways she dealt with privately. But she found that she was more capable than she'd given herself credit for, and that Caleb, without making a speech about it, without commentary, had begun adjusting tasks and timing in ways that used her strengths rather than highlighting the gaps. She noticed this. She didn't mention it. One afternoon in late October, they were replacing boards on the south side of the barn, a task that had been deferred too long and could not be deferred any further with winter coming. Caleb was on a ladder. Evelyn was handing up boards from below, holding each one steady against the wind while he set and nailed it. It was cold, and the wind was impatient, and they had been at it for 2 hours. "Hold it about 2 inches higher," Caleb said. She adjusted. He nailed. The board settled in. "The man from Billings," Caleb said, from up on the ladder without preamble. "The feed crop work you mentioned. You've been writing to him." "I have," Evelyn said. She handed up the next board. "His name is Aldous Mercer. He was a professor of agricultural science before he moved out here. He's done some practical work with drought-tolerant varieties that could change what we're able to do with the south and east sections." Could change or would change? Could. There are variables I can't control for without knowing the specifics of our soil composition more precisely, which is why I want to bring him out here to look at the land himself. She steadied the next board against the wind. "I know that costs money we don't have in surplus. I want to talk to you about whether we can make it work." Caleb was quiet for a moment, working. Then, "How did you find him?" "I wrote to 3 agricultural colleges," Evelyn said. "I asked each of them for the names of practitioners who had done serious work with drought conditions in Montana specifically. His name came up in 2 of the 3 responses." Caleb descended the ladder 1 rung, reached for the next board, and looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the post office. A different look entirely. "When did you write to the colleges?" "On the train," Evelyn said, "before I arrived." She met his eyes. "I told you. I intended to be useful." He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed through his expression that she had no name for, and then he turned back to the work, setting the board, driving the nail with the efficient force of someone who had done this thousands of times. "Write to Mercer," he said. "Tell him we can't pay much for the visit. Tell him what we have to offer and let him decide." "All right," Evelyn said. They worked in silence for a while. The wind pushed at them and the sky went darker in the north, and somewhere over the ridge a hawk was doing something about a problem it had with the thermals. "Evelyn," Caleb said. She looked up. He was still on the ladder, looking at the board he'd just set, not at her. "I've been—" He stopped, rebuilt. "What I said at the post office, when I didn't know you were there." She waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to address that," he said, "and I keep not finding the right way to say it, but I wanted you to know I've been thinking about it." Evelyn considered several responses and discarded all of them. She chose, finally, the truth. "I've heard worse," she said, "from people who knew me longer and should have known better." She paused. "I'm not keeping a score, Caleb. I'm not waiting to hold it over you. What I want is to build something here that we can both be proud of, and I can't do that if I'm carrying a grudge." She reached up to steady the last board of the row. "So consider it said. We both heard it, and now we're here." He was quiet for a long time. Then he came down the ladder, set it against the barn wall, and picked up the hammer again. "3 more rows," he said. "I know," she said, and handed him the next board. November arrived with the specific kind of cold that Montana uses to remind people of their place in things. The first hard frost took out the last of what had been a modest kitchen garden and locked the ground in ways that changed what work was possible. Caleb spent more time indoors doing the maintenance tasks that couldn't be done in summer. The equipment, the tack, the 100 small repairs that a ranch deferred until it had to. Orrin had taken on a secondary task that Evelyn had asked him about quietly. He was making a record of the water sources on the property, including the spring on the north edge, its flow rate, its seasonal variation, anything he knew about its history. She hadn't told Caleb this yet. She was building a picture first. The letter from Roy Candler's attorney that came on a Wednesday in the second week of November was different from the previous ones. It was shorter. It did not argue. It made an offer. The offer was for the property at a price that was technically fair by current assessed values and practically insulting given what the land actually contained. It was the kind of offer that looked reasonable to anyone who didn't know about the water rights, the spring, or the systematic acquisition of surrounding properties that gave this particular piece of land a value that the county assessor's records did not reflect. Caleb read the letter. He looked at the number. "That's not nothing," he said. "It's not nothing," Evelyn agreed. "It's also not what this land is worth." He set the letter down. He looked at her. "How do you know what it's worth?" "I've been figuring that out," she said. "The spring on the north edge is more significant than your deed describes it. Your deed says seasonal water feature. The surveyor's report from 1879, the one I found in the barn trunk, describes it as a permanent spring with year-round flow and access to the Lander Creek system." She paused. "If those two descriptions are of the same thing, and I believe they are, then whoever wrote your current deed significantly understated the water asset." Caleb stared at her. "When did you—" "3 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't want to tell you until I'd verified it more thoroughly." She pulled a piece of paper from the ledger she'd been using as a working document. "Orrin has been measuring the flow twice a week. Even in November, it hasn't varied by more than a small amount. That's not seasonal, that's permanent." Caleb took the paper. He looked at the numbers Orrin had recorded in his small, careful handwriting. "If Roy Candler knows about the spring, really knows about it," he started. "Then his offer price isn't careless," Evelyn said. "It's deliberate. He's offering you fair market value on the land as officially described, knowing that the official description is incomplete." She looked at him steadily. "He's hoping you'll take it because you're desperate, or he's planning to eventually force a sale and get it at assessed value through the legal process." She paused. "Either way, he wins and we lose a piece of land that is worth considerably more than what he's offering." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb put the paper down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, then looked up. "What do we do?" he said. It was the most direct he had ever asked her this. "We get the deed corrected," Evelyn said. "We file a formal application with the county land office to update the property description to reflect the actual water feature as documented in the 1879 survey. We do this in public, on record, before Roy Candler has any reason to think we know about the discrepancy." She paused. "If the current deed description was deliberately altered or negligently filed, that may be something for another conversation. Right now, I just want the record to be accurate. What if someone at the land office tells him what we're doing?" "Someone probably will," Evelyn said. "That's all right. We're not doing anything wrong. We're correcting an error in our own deed. He can't stop that." She paused. "But it will tell him something. It will tell him that we know what we have." Caleb looked at her. The lamp was between them, the same as it always was in these late evening conversations, and his face in the light looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been fighting something long enough that tired is just the baseline condition now. "How much time do we have?" he said. "Before he makes another move." Evelyn considered. "He'll want to move before we get the deed corrected, which means probably not long." She paused. "I want to go to the land office in the morning." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I'll drive you," he said. Evelyn nodded. She began organizing the papers she would need. The 1879 survey report, the current deed, Orrin's water measurements, the letters she'd written and received, the copy of the original loan document. She made a second set of copies and put them separately. Caleb watched her work. "You thought about this before, he said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be sure I wasn't wrong about the spring before I said anything, and I wanted to have the documentation ready so we could move quickly when the time came." "How do you know the time is now?" Evelyn looked up from her papers. "Because the offer letter means he's ready to close this out one way or another. He wouldn't have made an offer if he thought he could simply wait us into failure." She held his gaze. "He's worried we might survive. That's the first good news we've had." Caleb absorbed this. He looked at the stack of papers she was assembling, methodical and precise, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. Not a relaxation exactly, but a different kind of tension. The kind that comes with having a direction to move in instead of just something to brace against. "Early," he said. "I want to be on the road before 7. "I'll be ready," Evelyn said. She kept working. Outside, the November wind found every gap in the old house and tested it, and the lamp held steady on the table between them, and the papers accumulated into something that looked, from the right angle, a little like a plan. They left before 7, as Caleb had said. The road to town was frozen hard enough that the wagon moved faster than usual, the wheels finding purchase on ground that in warmer months turned to mud at the slightest provocation. Evelyn sat beside Caleb with the document satchel on her lap, and her hands folded over it, and neither of them spoke much for the first half of the ride. The silence was not uncomfortable. It had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around the 3rd week, without either of them marking the exact moment it changed. The land office in Harlan Crossing opened at 8, and was staffed by a clerk named Purvis Hale, who was approximately the age of the building he worked in, and had the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that his job required him to serve whoever came through the door, regardless of his personal opinions about them. He looked up when Caleb and Evelyn came in, and his eyes went to the document satchel before they went to either of their faces, which told Evelyn something. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. Then, with a slight but genuine adjustment, "Mrs. Whitaker." "Mr. Hale," Evelyn said, "we're here to file a correction to the property description on the Whitaker deed. I have the original survey document and supporting documentation." She set the satchel on the counter and opened it. "Specifically, we're requesting that the water feature described in the 1879 Mercer County survey be accurately reflected in the current deed, which presently describes it as a seasonal water feature, when the survey documentation shows it to be a permanent spring with continuous flow into the Lander Creek watershed." Purvis Hale looked at the 1879 survey document she placed in front of him. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes but wishes he didn't. "This is a significant correction," he said. "Not a refusal. But not enthusiasm either." "It's an accurate one," Evelyn said pleasantly. "I understand the process requires a formal application, a review period, and a fee. I have all of that prepared." She produced the application form she had drafted herself, copied from the standard form she had obtained by writing to the county offices 3 weeks ago. "I also have our measurements of the spring's flow over the past month, which support the permanent classification." Purvis Hale looked at the stack of documents. He looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly behind Evelyn, and to her left, in the way that he had developed without discussion, present, visible, but not in front of her. "I'll need to verify this against our records," Hale said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "We'll wait." They waited. Hale disappeared into the back room. They could hear the sound of drawers opening. Caleb shifted his weight once, and Evelyn put her hand briefly on his arm. Just a touch, meaning hold, and he went still again. Hale was in the back for 11 minutes. When he came out, his expression had acquired a careful quality that had not been there before. "I'll process the application," he said. "Review period is 30 days, standard." "I understand," Evelyn said. "Can you confirm the application has been received and date stamped in the official record?" Hale looked at her. "That's standard procedure." "I know. I'd like to watch you do it." There was a short silence. Then Hale reached under the counter, produced the official stamp, and applied it to the application with the deliberate manner of a man who had just been told he was being watched, and had decided the cleanest response was simply to do his job correctly. "Receipt," Evelyn said. He wrote the receipt. She took it, checked the date and the application number, and put it with the other documents. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said. "We appreciate your help." Outside in the cold, Caleb let out a slow breath that had been building for 11 minutes. "He knows Candler," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Most people in this building probably know Candler," Evelyn said. She was looking at the receipt, making sure it said exactly what she needed it to say. "That's all right. The application is filed and date stamped. Whatever Candler finds out, and however quickly he finds it out, the record exists. And if he tries to make the record disappear?" Evelyn looked up. "I made 3 copies before we left this morning. 1 is in the satchel, 1 is in the trunk in our bedroom, 1 is in an envelope I'm going to mail to Aldous Mercer in Billings today, with a letter explaining what it is and asking him to hold it." She paused. "He can make things difficult. He can't unmake something that exists in multiple places at once." Caleb looked at her for a moment. The cold had put color into her face, and her breath made small clouds in the November air, and she was holding a land office receipt with the focused attention most people reserve for things they expected to need in court. "When did you decide to mail a copy to Mercer?" he said. "Yesterday," Evelyn said, "when I realized that the only people I trust in this county are you, me, and Orrin, and that I should probably have someone outside it." Caleb almost said something. He stopped himself, and the thing he almost said stayed between them, invisible but present. "Post office is on the way to the livery," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Let's go." Aldous Mercer arrived at the Whitaker Ranch on a Thursday in late November, 2 weeks after the land office filing. He was a compact man in his late 50s who wore round spectacles and moved through a piece of land, the way some people move through a library, with a reverence that was also entirely practical, touching things to understand them rather than to admire them. He had responded to Evelyn's letter within 4 days, agreed to come for what he called a working visit rather than a formal consultation, and asked her to send him whatever soil composition data she had available before he made the trip. She had sent him everything she had. He had written back with 11 questions, each one more specific than the last, and she had answered all of them. When he arrived, Caleb shook his hand and showed him to the kitchen, and Mercer sat down at the table with his satchel and pulled out a folder of notes that were, Evelyn noticed, heavily annotated in the margins in a handwriting even smaller and more precise than her own. "The South Pasture compaction is going to be your most expensive problem," Mercer said, within 4 minutes of sitting down. He had the manner of a man who considered social preamble an inefficiency. "Not because the fix is complicated, but because the time required is non-negotiable. You can't hurry soil recovery." "I know," Evelyn said. "The East Well." He looked at his notes. "You said it stopped producing last July. Was there any warning before it went dry? Any change in pressure or taste before the final failure?" Caleb leaned forward. "The taste changed in maybe April, May. Went a little mineral. I thought it was just the season." Mercer wrote something. "That mineral change usually indicates a shift in the water table rather than a dry aquifer. The good news is that means the water is likely still there, just moving differently." He paused. "The bad news is getting at it requires knowing where it went, which requires some testing. I can't do today, but can arrange." He asked questions for 2 hours. He asked about the cattle, their health, their grazing patterns, which sections of the property they preferred, and which they avoided. He asked about the weather patterns Caleb had observed over 10 years on the property, the years of good rainfall and the years of drought, and what the land had done with each. He asked Evelyn about the correspondence with the county agricultural extension, which she had also initiated during the first month and which had produced 2 moderately useful responses, and one that was genuinely interesting. Then they walked the land. Mercer walked it the way he read his notes, methodically, back and forth, not missing anything. He crouched at the south pasture and took soil samples with a small kit he carried in his coat pocket. He paced the fence lines and looked at what was growing along them, because what grew voluntarily in a place told you things that deliberate cultivation concealed. He found the spring on the north edge and stood at it for a long time, measuring its flow with a small gauge and not saying anything. It was Caleb who finally broke the silence. "What does the flow rate tell you?" Mercer looked up. "It tells me that whoever described this as a seasonal water feature in your deed either didn't test it in winter or had a reason to misrepresent it." He capped his gauge. "This is a permanent spring, solid, consistent flow. I'd want to test it through March to be certain, but based on what I'm seeing, I'm confident in that assessment." He paused. "Do you know how long the deed has carried that inaccurate description?" "We don't know when it changed," Evelyn said. "The 1879 survey describes it correctly. The current deed doesn't." Mercer looked at her over his spectacles. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but something in his expression shifted. "Is there a legal matter attached to this?" "There is," Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm a scientist, not a lawyer," he said. "But I'll tell you what I know, and what I know is that this spring, if properly documented and defended, represents a water right that would be significant in any formal valuation of this property." He paused. "Considerably more significant than a seasonal water feature." "We know," Evelyn said. Mercer looked at her steadily. "Are you going to be all right?" It was an unexpected question, asked without condescension. It was the question of a man who had been paying attention. "We're working on it," Evelyn said. He nodded once, as if that was an acceptable answer, and went back to looking at the spring. That evening, Mercer sat with them at the kitchen table and laid out what he thought could be done with the Whitaker property over a 2-year period, given the right approach. He was specific about what was possible and what was not. He did not oversell. He said twice that he was giving them what the science suggested and that conditions on the ground would vary, and that variation was not failure, it was just reality. What he described was something considerably different from what the Whitaker Ranch had been doing. The South Pasture, once the compaction was addressed over the next 18 months, could support drought-tolerant feed crops that would reduce their dependence on purchased feed and potentially allow them to sell surplus. The north section, with proper management of the spring's water access, could support significantly more cattle than the current 31 head. The east section, once the water table issue was understood and addressed, could be productive again within a year. And there was one more thing. The Lander Creek watershed connection, Mercer said, setting down his coffee. If the spring connects to Lander Creek the way the 1879 survey suggests, then your water right potentially includes a claim on that tributary access. That's not a small thing in this county. He looked at Caleb. Has anyone ever raised this with you formally? No, Caleb said. Has anyone ever approached you about water rights specifically, as distinct from property acquisition? Caleb and Evelyn looked at each other. The approach has always been about the property, Evelyn said slowly. But if the water right is the actual value, then acquiring the property is the mechanism for acquiring the water right. She stopped. He doesn't need to mention the water right specifically. He just needs the land. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Who is this person you're dealing with? Mercer asked. The man who holds our loan, Caleb said. Mercer looked at his coffee cup. I'll do what I can to provide written documentation of the spring's characteristics, he said. As a scientist, not as a party to any legal matter. But my findings are my findings, and I'll put them in writing. He paused. Make sure your land application is airtight. It is, Evelyn said. What? Mercer left the following morning. He shook Caleb's hand and then, with a slight deliberateness that said he had thought about this, shook Evelyn's as well. He told her she had done good analysis given the tools available to her, and that her soil notes had been the most organized he'd received from a non-professional correspondent. She thanked him, and meant it. After his wagon disappeared down the north road, Caleb stood on the porch in the cold for a moment. He confirmed everything you thought, he said. He confirmed the science, Evelyn said. The legal question is separate. But together they make something. Yes, Evelyn said. Together they make something. She went inside. She had a letter to write to a real estate law office in Helena, where she had been directed by a letter of inquiry she'd sent 2 months ago. She had been building toward this particular letter for weeks, waiting until she had enough to put in it to make it worth sending. She thought she had enough now. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote for an hour, stopping twice to reread what she had and make sure she was being precise without editorializing. When she was done, she read it back from the beginning. It was a good letter. It laid out the discrepancy between the 1879 survey and the current deed, the pattern of surrounding land acquisitions, the loan acceleration attempt and its procedural deficiency, Roy Candler's approach through the intermediary, Decker, the offer letter that had undervalued the water asset, and Mercer's preliminary scientific findings on the spring. It asked for a legal assessment of whether there was a viable case and on what grounds. She sealed it and addressed it. She did not tell Caleb she was sending it, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she needed to know whether there was a case before she gave him a reason to hope for one, and hope was something she had learned to handle carefully. December came in with its full weight. The work narrowed to the essentials, keeping the animals alive, keeping the equipment functional, keeping the house warm enough to be inhabitable. Evelyn had never spent a winter in Montana and was discovering that it was a different category of experience than the Philadelphia winters she had known. The cold here was not polite. It didn't respect the boundaries of buildings. It found the gaps and stayed there. She managed. She was sore in ways she hadn't been before. She ran out of the particular hand cream she had packed from Philadelphia and discovered that beef tallow was an adequate substitute, which she would not have guessed 3 months ago. She learned to dress in layers in a specific order that Orrin demonstrated without comment. She learned to check the water lines first thing in the morning because twice they had frozen, and once the delay in catching it had cost them 2 hours of labor. What she noticed, doing all of this, was Caleb. not in the way she had noticed him initially, the assessment of a woman trying to understand a man she was going to have to live with, in a different way. The way you notice someone when you've stopped performing your observation and are just seeing them directly. He was a hard worker in the way that had stopped being impressive because it was simply what he was, not a quality he demonstrated, but a condition of his existence. He was patient with the animals in a manner that was consistent and real, not managed. He was harder on himself than on anything else around him, which she recognized as a specific kind of person and a specific kind of problem. He had opinions he held with conviction and released with difficulty, which was also something she recognized, if she was honest. And she was still cataloging this, still uncertain about what she was seeing, begun to see her. Not to tolerate her. Not to appreciate her usefulness in the way you appreciate a tool that performs its function. To actually see her, in the way that people see each other when they have been through something together, and the thing they went through required both of them. She did not allow herself to weight this heavily. There was too much still unresolved, too much that could still go wrong, for her to build anything on something as uncertain as what she thought she saw in a man's face in the kitchen light. But she noticed it. She was not dishonest enough with herself to pretend she didn't. The letter from the Helena Law Office arrived the third week of December. The attorney's name was Thomas Bray. His letter was 4 pages, which was more than Evelyn had expected and more than she'd dared hope for. He had reviewed the information she'd provided and identified 3 potential lines of legal action, each with a different probability of success and a different cost of pursuit. The most promising, in his assessment, was a claim based on the discrepancy between the 1879 survey and the current deed, combined with evidence of a pattern of conduct that suggested the acquisition of surrounding properties was connected to a specific intent regarding the water right. He used the word fraud. He used it carefully, hedged with qualifications, but he used it. He also told her what it would cost to retain him. Evelyn read the letter twice, then put it face down on the table and sat with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall for a moment, doing math she did not enjoy doing. They didn't have what Bray was asking for. They had some of it. They had maybe 1/3 of what he needed as a retainer. She turned the letter back over and read the 3rd page again. Bray had included a paragraph about payment arrangements in cases where the client's financial position was limited, but the merit of the case was sufficient. She read it carefully. It was not an offer, but it was the outline of a conversation. She picked up her pen and wrote him back that afternoon. She told him what they had, what they could commit to, and what their timeline pressures were. She did not make it sound better than it was. She made it sound exactly like what it was. A legitimate case being pursued by people with limited resources against an opponent with considerably more of them, and a request to discuss whether there was a way to proceed. Then she set the letter aside and went to find Caleb. I was in the barn with Orrin, working on the equipment that needed its winter attention. She came in from the cold and both men looked up, and Orrin had the instinct to find something that needed doing on the far side of the barn. I need to show you something, Evelyn said. She showed him the letter. She sat on a hay bale and let him read it standing up, because that was how he processed things, on his feet. He read it through once, then went back to the paragraph with the word fraud, and read it again. He thinks we have a case, Caleb said. He thinks there are grounds for one, Evelyn said. That's not the same thing, but it's more than I was sure we'd get. Caleb lowered the letter. He looked at the barn's high ceiling for a moment in the way he had of looking at distance when he was thinking through something large. Can we afford him? Not at his initial number, Evelyn said. I've written to him about an arrangement. I don't know yet if he'll take it. She paused. I wanted you to know what I found before I knew whether we could act on it. You have a right to know what we're dealing with. Caleb looked at her. Something in his face was different than it had been when she first started coming to him with things. The early wariness had not disappeared entirely, but there was something underneath it now, or maybe in place of some of it, that was steadier. You've been doing this since before you arrived, he said, working toward this. I've been working toward having a choice, Evelyn said. I didn't know what the choice would be until I knew what we were dealing with. What do you need from me? I need you to trust me to handle the correspondence with Bray, she said. And I need, she paused, measuring, I need you to tell me if there's anything about the property's history I don't know yet. Anything that Bray might find in a deeper investigation that we should know about first. Caleb was quiet. There's no mortgage I don't know about, she added, No other claims. I've checked the recorded documents. I mean something else. Family history, old agreements, handshake deals. The things that don't always make it into the records. He was quiet for a longer moment. My father made a verbal agreement with the Henley family, maybe 15 years ago, about grazing access across the north boundary. The Henleys are gone now. Their property was one of the ones Candler picked up. I don't know if that agreement has any remaining legal weight. Do you know what the terms were? Seasonal access? Reciprocal. We could cross their north line in summer. They could use our east water access in drought years. Evelyn thought about this. If Candler owns the Henley property now, he might try to argue that agreement transferred with the land, that we owe him water access under the original terms. Is that possible? I don't know, she said honestly. I'll ask Bray. She stood. Thank you for telling me. Caleb handed the letter back. His hand, she noticed, was steadier than hers had been when she read it the first time. Write to Bray, he said. See what he says. What Bray said arrived in the first week of January, and it was not what Evelyn had expected. He would take the case on a modified retainer, lower up front, with the balance contingent on outcome. He cited the strength of the documentary evidence as his reason. He did not say he expected to win. He said the evidence warranted the effort, which was the kind of thing that a cautious man said when he believed something but was too professional to claim certainty. He also addressed the Henley grazing agreement. It was, in his assessment, a complication but not a fatal one. Verbal agreements of that type were difficult to enforce, particularly across a change of ownership, and particularly when the party claiming the benefit had not honored the reciprocal terms. Has Candler ever asked to use your water access? Evelyn read aloud to Caleb at the kitchen table. Not once, Caleb said. Then he hasn't performed his side of the agreement, Evelyn said, which means he can't claim the benefit of your side. She set the letter down. We have a lawyer. Caleb sat back in his chair. He looked at the kitchen ceiling. He stayed that way for a moment that stretched longer than silence usually needed to, and Evelyn let it. I want to ask you something, he said, not looking down yet. All right, she said. He looked at her. Why did you stay? Not the reason you came, that... I understand that. But after the first week, after you heard what I said at the post office and saw what the place actually looked like and understood how bad the situation was, why didn't you find a reason to leave? Evelyn considered the question. She had known it was coming, eventually, and she had thought about her answer more than once without landing on exactly the right words. Because the situation was solvable, she said, and because... She stopped. Rebuilt. I've spent a long time in places where people had already decided what I was, where the conclusion was formed before the evidence was examined. I came here knowing you had already decided what I was. And I thought, if I leave because of that, then I'm letting their conclusion stand. And I don't believe in letting wrong conclusions stand when there's evidence to the contrary. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. And the ranch, he said. That was the evidence? The ranch was part of it, she said. You were part of it too. You're a more complicated man than you want people to see. She met his eyes. That interested me. He was quiet. The lamp was between them, the same as always. I'm not... He started, then stopped. I know, she said. Not unkindly. I'm not asking you to be anything in particular. I'm just telling you the truth because you asked. He nodded slowly. He looked at the lamp for a moment, then he looked back at her. I'm glad you didn't leave, he said. It was plainly said. No decoration, no qualification. The most unguarded thing she had heard him say. Evelyn held it for a moment, carefully, like something that might break if she held it too tightly. So am I, she said. January gave them 2 weeks of relative quiet, which they used. The correspondence with Bray continued. He was building his case file and needed specific documents, specific dates, specific wording from the letters Roy Candler's attorney had sent. Evelyn provided everything he asked for, organized chronologically, with a summary note on each item explaining its relevance. Bray wrote back saying her documentation was the most organized plaintiff file he had received in 11 years of practice. She was not sure if this was a compliment or a comment on the general state of his clients. Mercer sent his written report on the spring in mid-January. It was 6 pages of careful scientific language that concluded, in its final paragraph, that the water source on the north edge of the Whitaker property was a permanent spring with reliable year-round flow feeding into the Lander Creek watershed, and that the description of this source as a seasonal water feature in the current property deed was, in his professional assessment, inaccurate. Evelyn made 5 copies. One went to Bray immediately. The land office review period expired on the 23rd of January. Purvis Hale's written determination arrived the following day. He had approved the deed correction. She read the determination twice. Then she walked to the barn where Caleb was working and handed it to him without a word. He read it. He read it again. He handed it back. "It's done?" he said. "The deed is corrected," she said. "The spring is now officially described as a permanent water feature connected to the Lander Creek watershed." She folded the document. "That changes what this property is worth, formally and on the record. It changes what any assessment Roy Candler tries to make will have to account for." She paused. "It also, in Bray's view, strengthens the fraud argument considerably, because now there is an official record of what the property contains, and that record can be compared to the record as it stood when the original loan was written, and those 2 records tell a story." Caleb looked at her. "What kind of story?" he said, though she thought he already knew. "The kind that asks why a banker who held a loan on a property would have a vested interest in that property's water right being undervalued in the official record," Evelyn said. The barn was very quiet around them, just the animals and the cold and the distant sound of wind working on the roof. "We're going after him," Caleb said. Not a question. "Bray is going after him," Evelyn said. "We're providing the evidence. That's the right division of labor." She looked at him steadily. "But yes, we're not defending anymore. We're filing." Caleb absorbed this. She watched the thing it did to him. Not quite relief, not quite triumph, but something between them. The feeling of a man who has been waiting for a direction and has finally got one. "When?" he said. "Bray says 3 weeks. He wants to complete the case file before he files anything, and he wants to file everything at once so there's no opportunity to respond to one element before the others are on record." She paused. "He also said that when this becomes public, Roy Candler will move quickly. We should be prepared for that." "What does quickly look like?" "We don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "That's the part I can't plan for in advance." She looked at him. "But whatever he does, we have the deed, we have the spring documentation, we have the loan document with the procedural deficiency. We have the records of the surrounding land acquisitions, and we have a lawyer who has reviewed all of it and decided it's worth fighting for." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you afraid?" Evelyn considered the question. She had been thinking about fear a great deal lately. The difference between the fear that stopped you and the fear that was simply what working towards something felt like when the stakes were real. "Yes," she said, "but not more afraid than I am determined." She paused. "Does that help?" He looked at her with the expression she had come to know. The one that happened when she said something he hadn't anticipated, the one that was most like the person she thought lived behind everything else he showed the world. "Yeah," he said, "it does." She nodded once and went back to the house to write to Bray. Behind her she heard Caleb go back to his work, the steady, unhurried sound of a man who had something to work toward, which is a different sound than a man who is simply enduring. She noticed the difference. She let herself notice it. Outside, the January sky had the cold, flat brightness of a day that had decided to be clear without being warm, and the spring on the north edge of the property ran on, indifferent to all of it, the way true things do. Thomas Bray filed on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February, and by Thursday afternoon the news had reached every counter and back room in Harlan Crossing. Evelyn knew it had arrived not because anyone told her, but because of the way people looked at her when she went to the general store on Friday to pick up the monthly supplies. There was a new quality to the looking, not the familiar assessment of a woman who didn't belong, but something more alert, more uncertain. The look people wear when something they assumed was fixed has started moving. Margaret Torrey, at the diner counter, said good morning to her for the first time without qualification. Evelyn bought her supplies and went home. The filing, as Bray had structured it, named Roy Candler and the Harlan Crossing First Bank in a civil action alleging fraudulent misrepresentation of a secured property's assessed value, improper conduct in the acceleration of a loan obligation, and a pattern of land acquisition suggesting coordinated interference with the plaintiff's property rights. It requested injunctive relief preventing any further acceleration attempts pending resolution, a formal reassessment of the property's value under the corrected deed, and damages to be determined. Bray had also, with Evelyn's knowledge and approval, sent copies of the filing to the Montana Territorial Banking Commission and to a newspaper in Helena that covered commercial and legal matters in the region. This last piece had been a discussion. "The newspaper," Caleb had said when she had laid it out for him, "you want to make it public before there's a ruling." "I want to make it public before Candler can settle it quietly," Evelyn had said. "If this stays between his lawyers and ours, he has more resources and more time. If the Banking Commission is looking at it and a newspaper has asked for comment, then he has a different kind of problem, one that money and local relationships can't fully solve." Caleb had thought about it for a while. What if the newspaper makes us look, he searched for the word, desperate? People taking swings at the bank because they can't pay their debts? "That's a real risk," Evelyn had said, "which is why I asked Bray to provide the newspaper with specific documentation. The procedural deficiency in the acceleration letter, the comparison between the 1879 survey and the current deed, the timeline of surrounding land acquisitions. The story isn't struggling rancher fights bank. The story is bank officer manipulates county records and loan documents to acquire water rights." She had paused. "Those are different stories. One gets sympathy, the other gets attention." Caleb had sat with this. Then, "You've thought about this more than I have." "I've had more time to think about it," Evelyn had said. "You've been keeping this ranch alive. Someone had to plan for what happens if we do." So Bray had sent the documentation to the Helena paper, and the filing had gone in. And now it was Friday, and Margaret Torrey had said good morning, and the town was doing what small towns always did with news, which was to take it in and rework it and pass it out again in a shape that fit what people already believed or wanted to believe. What Evelyn wanted to know was what Roy Candler was doing. She found out on Monday. Candler did not come himself this time. He sent his attorney, a man named Hargrove, from out of county, which meant Candler had decided that his local arrangements were no longer sufficient for what he was facing. Hargrove arrived at the ranch in a hired coach, which Orrin announced from the barn with the economy of a man who had learned to read arrivals. "Coach from the North Road. Looks like money." Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the case file. She put it in the trunk in the bedroom, closed the lid, and went to the door. Hargrove was a tall man with a briefcase and the polished composure of someone who was paid to be composed regardless of circumstances. He introduced himself and said he was there to discuss a potential resolution of the recently filed civil action. "Come in," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." She made coffee. She put the cups on the table. She sat down and waited. Caleb came in from outside. She had sent Orrin for him when the coach arrived, and sat beside her. He had barn dust on his coat and didn't apologize for it. Hargrove set his briefcase on the table and opened it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times and wanted that to be apparent. He produced a document. "My client is prepared to offer a full discharge of the outstanding loan balance," Hargrove said, "in exchange for the transfer of the north section of the property, specifically the 37 acres encompassing the water feature on the north edge, along with an easement for access to the Lander Creek watershed." Evelyn looked at the document without touching it. "He wants the spring," she said. "My client is interested in a practical resolution that benefits both parties," Hargrove said. "I wants the spring," Evelyn said again. "Not aggressive, just precise." Hargrove adjusted slightly. "The offer clears your debt entirely. The remaining property, the majority of your acreage, the house, the barn, the existing herd, remains fully yours, unencumbered." Caleb looked at the document. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something back. "What's the debt figure the discharge covers?" Evelyn asked. Hargrove told her. She nodded slowly. It was accurate. She had the number memorized. "And what is the assessed value of 37 acres on the north section at current county rates, including the corrected water feature description as filed last month?" A very slight pause in Hargrove's composure. "I don't have that specific—" "I do," Evelyn said. "It's approximately 4 times the outstanding loan balance, more if you include the Lander Creek access value, which your client's own land acquisitions suggest he believes is significant." She looked at Hargrove steadily. "He's offering to clear a debt worth $1 by taking an asset worth $4. I understand why that's a practical resolution for him. I'm less clear on how it benefits us. Hargrove shifted. He was good at his job, which meant he didn't argue the math directly. The offer also avoids the cost and uncertainty of litigation. We have an attorney who believes the case merits the effort, Evelyn said, and a banking commission that is currently reviewing the conduct described in our filing. She paused. What else does your client's offer include? A short silence. That's the current offer, Hargrove said. Then we'll decline it, Evelyn said. She said it the same way she said everything, without heat, without satisfaction. We appreciate your client's interest in a resolution, and if he would like to propose terms that reflect the actual value of what he's asking for, we'd be willing to review them. She stood. I'll see you out. Hargrove packed his briefcase with the careful movements of a man who was recalculating. At the door, he paused. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, my client has considerable resources and considerable patience. I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what extended litigation. I understand it, Evelyn said. Thank you for coming. She closed the door. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, not turning around. Behind her, she could hear Caleb not moving, not speaking, just present. She let herself breathe once, fully, before she turned. You all right? Caleb said. Yes, she said. She moved back toward the table. He'll go back and tell Candler we said no, and Candler will decide what that means about us. She picked up the coffee cups. I want to write to Bray today and tell him what was offered and what we said. He needs to know Candler is trying to settle. What does that tell Bray? It tells him Candler is worried, Evelyn said. A man who is confident in his legal position doesn't send an attorney to a ranch with a settlement offer 2 weeks after being served. She carried the cups to the wash basin. It tells us the case is stronger than Candler hoped it was. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, 4 times the loan value. At least, Evelyn said. He sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them, and she recognized the gesture. She'd seen him do it before, in moments of absorbing something large. We could have lost all of this, he said. We almost did. We would have if you hadn't. You would have found it eventually, Evelyn said. No, he said. He said it simply, without drama, in the voice of a man reporting a fact. I wouldn't have. I was too deep in it to see it. I was working the problem the same way I'd always worked it and getting the same result. You came in from the outside and looked at it fresh and saw what I couldn't. Evelyn set down the cup she was washing and turned to look at him. You gave me the information I needed, she said. You answered every question I asked. You drove me to the land office, and you stood behind me and you told Candler's man to deal with me directly. She paused. I couldn't have done any of this without what you know about this land, and without your name on the deed. She held his gaze. It was both of us, Caleb. That's what both means. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did the thing she had stopped trying to name and just watched. All right, he said. All right, she said back. It was their word, the one they gave each other in the moments when there wasn't a larger word for what they meant. She was beginning to understand it carried more than it appeared to. February was when the ranch started to show what it was becoming, in the same tentative way that things beginning to heal announced themselves. Not dramatically, but in small evidences that accumulate. Mercer had arranged, through a colleague at the Agricultural College in Bozeman, for a soil testing kit to be sent with instructions specific to the Whitaker property's conditions. Evelyn worked through the tests on the south pasture over 4 days, recording every result with the methodical care that Mercer had told her was non-negotiable. What the test showed was consistent with what he'd assessed in person. The compaction was significant but not irreversible, and if they could begin the recovery process before spring, they had a real chance at workable pasture within 18 months. She told Caleb what the test showed. He looked at the numbers, which meant something to him in a physical, practical way they didn't entirely mean to her, and then looked at the south pasture through the kitchen window. My father wrote that section off 8 years ago, he said. Your father didn't have the soil testing data, Evelyn said. Or Mercer. Or you, Caleb said. I wasn't looking at her, still looking at the pasture, and the word landed differently for not being face-to-face. She absorbed it without responding to it directly, which she had found was often the right move with him. Orrin had also, quietly and on his own initiative, begun repairing the south fence with salvaged materials. He had not asked for direction on this. He had assessed what needed doing and done it, which was the manner in which Orrin operated, and Evelyn had come to regard it as one of the ranch's significant hidden assets. When she told him his fence work was good, he had said, without apparent need for elaboration, "You're going to need it standing when the pasture's ready." It was the most forward-looking statement she had heard anyone on the ranch make in the 4 months she had been there. "Yes," she said, "we are." The cattle, all 31 of them, had come through the deep winter months in condition that Caleb described as better than expected, which she understood to mean that they were not losing animals, and that their weight was holding at levels that would make for viable spring sales. This was not triumph, but it was not failure either. It was the ground level from which something better could be built. The Great Falls buyer she had contacted about premium dried beef had sent a follow-up letter asking about volume and timeline. She was not ready to answer that fully yet, but she wrote back to maintain the relationship, which was what you did with good buyers when the production wasn't quite there yet. You held the door open. What she was also doing, in parallel, and without most of these specific details shared with Caleb, was building a fuller picture of what the Whitaker Ranch could look like in 3 years, if the legal situation resolved and the land improvements proceeded as planned. She was not building this picture to show it to him yet. She was building it to know whether what she hoped was possible was actually possible, because she had learned that hope without a grounding in what was real was just a way of hurting yourself with something prettier than fear. The picture was, cautiously, good. Not easy. Not without risk. But good. She folded it away and kept working. The letter from the Montana Territorial Banking Commission arrived in the last week of February. It was addressed to the Whitaker Ranch and marked as official correspondence, which made Orrin bring it in from the mailbox with more than his usual care. It confirmed that a formal review of the lending practices of the Harlan Crossing First Bank, specifically relating to the loan account associated with the Whitaker property, had been opened. It noted that the Commission's review was independent of the civil action filed by the Whitakers' attorney and would proceed on its own timeline. It requested that the Whitakers preserve all documentation related to their loan and any communication with the bank. Evelyn read it and then read it again, not because it was unclear, but because she wanted to make sure she understood exactly what it was and was not. It was not a ruling, it was not a resolution, it was an investigation, which was different. Investigations could go nowhere. Investigations could be slow. Investigations could be influenced by the same local relationships that had made all of this possible for Roy Candler in the first place. But it was also a government body, which meant it operated on a different scale than county politics. And it was official, which meant it created a record that outlasted the goodwill of any individual. She sent a copy to Bray the same afternoon. Bray's response came within a week. He described the Commission's involvement as meaningful but not decisive in itself, and suggested it might motivate Candler's side toward a more serious settlement conversation than the February approach through Hargrove. He recommended they wait and watch what Candler did next before making any further moves. Waiting was something Evelyn was not naturally suited to. She understood its necessity. She was not good at the feeling of it. She managed by working. She always managed by working. What Candler did next came not through lawyers, but through the town itself, which was its own kind of move. Quieter, harder to respond to formally, and in some ways more corrosive than anything Hargrove had put on paper. Margaret Torrey at the diner reported to someone, who reported to someone else, who eventually told Orrin that there was talk circulating that the Whitakers' legal action was a desperate play by a failing operation to avoid an honest debt, and that the water spring claim was a fabrication being pushed by a Philadelphia woman who had never worked a piece of land in her life and had convinced a good but gullible man to let her run his affairs into the ground. Orrin reported this to Evelyn with the matter-of-fact quality he brought to all information, without apparent judgment, about how she would receive it. She received it without visible reaction. Then she went to find something to do with her hands, because her hands were the part of her that she couldn't control as well as her face. She found the fence line on the east section, which Orrin hadn't gotten to yet, and which needed attention before the spring thaw made the ground too soft to work it properly. She spent 2 hours on it in the cold, alone, resetting posts and pulling wire, and by the end of it, her hands were steady and her thinking was clear. The town believing something was not the same as the town being right. She knew this. She had known it her entire life, which was part of why it still hurt in the specific way it did. Not because it was new, but because familiarity with a pain didn't make it less painful, just more efficiently absorbed. What mattered was not whether the town believed it. What mattered was the banking commission, and the civil filing, and the deed that now correctly described the spring, and Bray's case file that documented the pattern with the kind of specificity that opinions in a diner couldn't address. She came in from the fence work at dusk and found Caleb in the kitchen. He looked at her hands, which were red from the cold and had a small cut on the right palm from a wire edge. He didn't ask where she'd been. He went to the cabinet, got the tin of salve they kept there, and held his hand out. She gave him her right hand. He cleaned the cut carefully with a clean cloth, the same careful attention he'd given her splinter on their first week, and applied the salve without saying anything. She watched the top of his head while he worked. "Orrin told you," she said. "Orrin told me," he said. He was still looking at her hand, making sure the cut was clean. "And?" He looked up. "And Roy Candler is a man who uses whatever tools are available to him. The legal tools aren't working the way he planned, so he's using the social ones." "Does it bother you?" she said. "What they're saying?" Caleb looked at her steadily. "No," he said. He said it without elaboration or performance, just the plain word. "I know what you are. I know what you've done here. What they're saying in town is about him, not you." Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. She was not going to make more of this than it was, but she was also not going to pretend it didn't reach somewhere in her that needed reaching. "Thank you," she said. He released her hand and put the salve tin back. "Eat something. You've been outside for 2 hours." "I know," she said. "Do you want me to tell you there's a reason to be optimistic about where this is going?" She sat down. "I want you to tell me if you think there is one." He sat across from her. The lamp was between them. He thought for a moment with the real quality of thinking, not the performance of it. "I think there is," he said. "I think we're still here in February, which is not where I thought we'd be in November. I think the ranch is in better shape than it was in September. I think we have a lawyer and a scientist and a government commission on our side of the table." He paused. "And I think the man trying to take this place from us is spreading rumors in a diner instead of winning in court, which suggests he knows the court isn't going his way." Evelyn looked at him. "That's a good analysis," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said, and he said it without the slight distance he used to put around things that came too close to direct. She did not respond to it. She looked at the lamp for a moment and let it settle around them. "I'll make supper," she said. "I'll help," he said. They had started doing this recently, not by arrangement, but by the natural drift of two people who had been working alongside each other long enough that the boundaries of task had softened. He did the things that required more height or strength. She did the things that required more precision. The result was faster and better than either of them working separately, which she thought about sometimes with the part of her mind that was always cataloging how things fit together. March came and the civil case moved into the phase that Bray had described as discovery, which meant that Roy Candler's attorneys were now required to produce documentation that the Whitakers' case had demanded. Bray wrote with periodic updates that were careful in their language. He never overpromised, which Evelyn respected. But the general direction of the updates was that the documentation being produced was, in some ways, more revealing than even Bray had anticipated. The most significant revelation came in a letter Bray sent in the third week of March, which she read at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Caleb was outside and Orrin was doing the morning rounds. The deed to the Whitaker property had been modified in the county records. Not the original deed, Bess. The original was what the 1879 survey reflected. But there had been a filing in 1889, 6 years ago, that had amended the property description to change the spring's designation from permanent to seasonal. This filing had been made by a clerk at the county land office. That clerk had since left county employment. The filing had been made in the same year Roy Candler had made his first significant land acquisition in the valley. Evelyn set the letter down. She picked it up. She read the relevant paragraph again, slowly. She set it down again. She was sitting in exactly the same position when Caleb came in from outside, and he stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter and pointed to the paragraph. He read it. He read it again. He set the letter on the table very carefully, as if it might do something if he moved it too quickly. "He changed the deed," Caleb said. "Someone did," Evelyn said. "In 1889, in the same year he started buying up the valley." "That's—" Caleb stopped. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. That's not just fraud on the loan, that's fraud on the public record. Yes, Evelyn said. They sat with this for a moment. The enormity of it required sitting with. This was not an aggressive loan tactic or a legal technicality exploited or even a deliberate undervaluation on a purchase offer. This was a man who had changed a county record to reduce the official value of a property he wanted, and had then used that reduced official value as the basis for a loan and a subsequent attempt to seize the property. Bray needs to know you've seen this, Evelyn said. I'll write to him today. What does this do to the case? I don't know the full legal answer, Evelyn said, but I know what it does to his position. It changes the story from a disputed loan to a documented pattern of conduct. She paused. It's also the kind of thing the Banking Commission can't ignore, because if a bank officer is connected to the alteration of county property records, that's not a commercial dispute. That's a criminal matter. Caleb looked at her. You're saying he might face criminal charges. I'm saying Bray will know what this opens up, Evelyn said. I'm not a lawyer. I won't get ahead of what I actually know. She paused. But yes, that's the direction this points. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room, looking at the yard, the barn, the fence line that had been coming back together over the winter. My father borrowed against this land to build the east barn, he said. He was proud of the deal he got from the bank. He thought Candler was a fair man. He was quiet for a moment. He died thinking he'd failed, that the land was failing and it was something he'd done wrong. He stopped. He was paying interest on a loan that was built on a fraudulent property valuation from the beginning. Evelyn watched his back. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Not yet. It needed the air it was taking up. After a long moment, Caleb turned. His face had a quality she hadn't seen before, underneath everything else. The exhaustion and the contained quality and the careful management of feeling. Something rawer and older. Is there a way to know, he said slowly, how far back this goes? Bray will look at that now, Evelyn said. He'll look at the history of the loan, the property valuations, all of it. She paused. It may not change the current case, but it will be part of the record. He nodded. He came back to the table and sat down. I want to write to Bray, he said. I want to be the one who writes this letter. Evelyn looked at him. This was new. He had left the correspondence to her by mutual unspoken understanding, because her facility with it was better, and they both knew it. Of course, she said. Tell me what you want to say, and I'll help you make sure it says it right. He looked at her for a moment. You're not going to just do it for me? You just said you wanted to write it, she said. I believe you should. I'll help where the language needs it. That's different from doing it for you. She paused. What do you want to say? He thought for a moment. Then he said slowly, I want to say that this goes back further than the current loan. I want to say that my father's dealings with this bank should be part of the review. And I want to say that whatever restitution is available, I want to understand fully what that includes. He paused. Can you say that in the kind of language Bray needs? I can help you, Evelyn said. But the letter should sound like you, not me. Bray knows the difference. They worked on the letter together for an hour. It was slower than when Evelyn worked alone, and more difficult, and better for both those reasons. When it was done, Caleb read it back once, changed 2 words, and signed it himself with the deliberate penhold of a man who did not write letters often and wanted this one to be right. He sealed it. He put it on the table. He looked at it. Whatever happens with the case, he said, whatever Bray finds, you know that none of this was your fault. Evelyn looked at him. I know that. I mean the situation I brought you into, he said. The debt, the ranch, the condition of things when you arrived. He paused. You didn't know the full scope of it. I didn't tell you the full scope of it. In the letter, I told you enough to get someone to come and not enough to scare them off. He looked at her directly. I'm sorry for that. It was the most direct apology she had received from him for anything. It landed differently than she expected. Not as satisfaction, not as the settling of a score, but as something that changed the texture of the room slightly, the way a window open changes the air. I knew it was bad, Evelyn said. I knew it was probably worse than the letter said. I came anyway. She paused. I'm not sorry I did. He held her gaze. Neither am I, he said. It was the second time he had said something of that shape to her. And the second time she held it carefully, not wanting to define it too quickly, not wanting to collapse what it might be by deciding too soon what it was. She picked up the letter. "I'll post this on Monday," she said. "I'll take it," he said. "I'll go to town myself." She looked at him. "I've been letting you go to town," he said. "Every time there was something that needed doing in Harlan Crossing, I let you do it. Because it was your skill and you were better at it." He paused. "But it's also my property and my family's history, and it's time I stood in front of that instead of behind it." Evelyn considered this. She could see the truth of it and also the cost of it, the way that small towns reabsorbed people who had retreated, which was not always gracefully. "All right," she said, "go to town, take the letter, stop at the diner and have a coffee where people can see you." She looked at him steadily. "And if anyone asks about the legal matter, tell them it's proceeding and you're confident, and don't say anything else. And if they ask about you, tell them the same thing you told Hargrove," she said, "that your wife handles the business correspondence." The edge of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was what came just before. "All right," he said. Spring arrived with the abruptness that Montana used, as if the season had been waiting outside the door and then decided all at once to come in. The ground thawed and then thawed further, and the south pasture, which had been frozen bare and silent all winter, began to show the preliminary signs of what Mercer had said it would do. Not recovery yet, not anything that looked like triumph, just the first evidence that the soil was alive under there and had not forgotten how to be. The legal case moved with the ungainly momentum of formal processes, which was to say, not fast, not always clear in its direction, but moving. Bray reported that the discovery of the 1889 deed modification had substantially complicated Candler's position, and that the Banking Commission had escalated its inquiry to include a review of the bank's complete records on all land-adjacent loans in the valley for the past 12 years. This last piece was not something Bray had engineered. The commission had done it on its own, which meant that people with enforcement authority had seen something worth looking at. Roy Candler had not been in his bank office for 2 weeks, according to Orrin, who had it from a cousin who worked at the livery and moved through town with the invisibility that came from being the kind of person most people forgot to notice. "Where is he?" Evelyn asked. "Helena," Orrin said. "Staying at a hotel there. His wife's with him." He paused. "Took a lot of luggage." Evelyn thought about this. "Does Bray know?" Caleb asked. "I'll write to him today," Evelyn said. A man who takes his wife and a lot of luggage to Helena while a banking commission investigation is underway is a man who is not confident about what happens next. She did not say this out loud. She didn't need to. Caleb was looking at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at the same conclusion. "We're not done yet," Evelyn said, because she needed to say it to keep the shape of the thing honest. "Nothing is decided. He could come back with a stronger legal strategy. The commission might find less than we think. Bray's case could hit obstacles we don't know about yet." "I know," Caleb said. "But," she paused. "But," he agreed. They were standing in the south pasture, the two of them, having walked out after supper because the March evening had a quality that invited being outside. The light was doing the thing it did in Montana at this time of year, staying long past when you expected it to leave, lying flat and golden across the land in a way that made everything look like the best version of itself. The pasture was not recovered. It was not yet what it was going to be. But there were things growing in it that hadn't been there in November, small and stubborn and persistently green, and Caleb was looking at them with the expression of a man who had stopped expecting the land to give him something and had started watching to see what it chose to do. Evelyn looked at the fence line Orrin had been rebuilding, which was now standing straight for the first quarter mile. She looked at the sky above the north edge, where the spring they now legally and officially owned moved through its channel toward Lander Creek. She looked at the distance where the Whitaker land ended, and the land that had once belonged to other families, families Roy Candler had systematically displaced, began. "When this is over," she said, "what do you want the ranch to be?" Caleb looked at her. "I want it to be something my father would have recognized," he said slowly, "and something he wouldn't have been able to imagine." He paused. "Both of those. At the same time." Evelyn looked at the pasture. "I think that's possible," she said. He stood beside her in the March light, and they looked at the land together, and neither of them spoke for a while. and the silence had the quality, rare and specific, of two people who do not need to fill it. The letter from Thomas Bray arrived on a Tuesday in early April, and it was longer than any he had sent before. Evelyn read it standing at the kitchen counter because she had not made it to the table before she started reading, and once she started, she didn't stop. Caleb came in from the morning rounds to find her still standing there, the letter in both hands, not moving. Evelyn. She looked up. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen it do before, not quite composed, not quite broken open, but somewhere between those two things, in the specific expression of someone who has been holding a position for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. "Sit down," she said. "I need to read this to you." He sat. She read. Bray's letter reported that the Montana Territorial Banking Commission had completed its preliminary investigation and issued a formal finding. The finding documented a pattern of conduct by Roy Candler and associates at the Harlan Crossing First Bank that included the manipulation of county property records on at least 4 occasions between 1887 and 1892, the deliberate undervaluation of secured property to create loan conditions favorable to subsequent acquisition, and the improper use of bank officer authority to influence county land office filings. The commission had referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal review. Roy Candler had, 3 days before the finding was issued, resigned his position at the bank. His attorneys had simultaneously contacted Bray to discuss resolution of the civil action. Candler's side was prepared to offer a full settlement. The terms Bray had negotiated, and here his letter became precise in the way of a man who had worked for something and wanted the recipient to understand exactly what had been achieved, included the complete discharge of all outstanding loan obligations on the Whitaker property, a cash settlement for damages representing the difference between the property's fraudulently assessed value and its correctly documented value at the time the loan was originated, a formal acknowledgement in the settlement record that the 1889 deed modification had been improper and that the spring on the north section had always been a permanent water feature, and the return, at assessed value, of any property within the valley whose sale had been influenced by the same pattern of record manipulation. That last piece covered 3 other families. Evelyn set the letter on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's done," Caleb said. His voice was careful, the way it always was when he was holding something large inside a small word. "He's done," Evelyn said. She sat down across from him. The letter was between them on the table, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle that only happened in April, when the sun had climbed back up to a height it hadn't been at since autumn, and it laid itself across the table in a way that made the ordinary objects on it, the coffee cups, the salt tin, the worn edge of the wooden surface, look, for a moment, like they were worth something beyond their function. Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without performance, just the action itself, plain and certain. She looked at his hand, she looked at him. "We did this," he said. "We did this?" she said. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside, Orrin was moving around the barn in his unhurried way, and the spring on the north edge was doing what it had always done, and the south pasture was quietly going about the business of recovering, and the Whitaker Ranch sat on its piece of Montana land exactly as it always had, except that it was, at last, fully and legally and permanently theirs. The settlement was finalized in 3 stages over the following 6 weeks, each stage requiring documentation and review and the kind of patience that Evelyn had developed over the preceding months as a specific and hard-won skill. Bray managed the process with the competence she had come to depend on, and he wrote to her at each significant point with the same careful precision, never overclaiming, never letting her read more into a step than it actually represented. The cash settlement arrived on a Friday in late May, transferred through the bank in Helena that had been appointed as interim administrator of the Harlan Crossing First Bank's obligations while the institution was being reviewed. It was not a vast sum. It would not make the Whitakers wealthy by any standard that wealth was generally measured, but it was enough, carefully managed, to fund the South Pasture recovery work Mercer had outlined, address the East Well situation with the testing and remediation he had recommended, repair the barn roof properly, rather than the ongoing series of patches that were losing the argument with Montana winters, expand the herd to a number that could make the ranch functionally profitable, and still leave a working reserve for the kind of unexpected emergencies that working land always eventually produced. Evelyn put the figures together over 2 evenings and presented them to Caleb not as a plan he needed to approve, but as a conversation about what they were going to do with the thing they had just saved. There was a distinction between those two things, and they both understood it without naming it. He had corrections on 2 items. She incorporated them. The final allocation was something they had both shaped. The herd first, Caleb said, looking at the numbers. Everything else can be phased, but the herd is what makes this a working cattle ranch instead of a piece of land with ambitions. Agreed, Evelyn said. Mercer thinks 60 head is the right number for where we are with the pasture capacity. We start there and expand as the south section comes back. 60 is manageable with 3 hands, she looked at him. We're going to need a 3rd hand. I know. He paused. I've been thinking about the Sullivan boy, from the Morrison place. He lost his position when Candler took the Morrison property. He knows cattle. How old is he? 20, maybe 21. He's young, but Orrin says he works. If Orrin says he works, Evelyn said. Talk to him. Caleb looked at her across the table. You trust Orrin's judgment that completely? I trust anyone who does what needs doing without being asked 3 times, she said. Orrin has been that person every single day since I got here. That kind of person has good judgment about other people. It's the same quality. She paused. Don't you trust his judgment? Caleb thought about it. Yes, he said. I do. I just never said it out loud before. Maybe tell him that sometime, Evelyn said. Not in a way that makes it strange, just so he knows. Caleb looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to catalog and had simply started receiving as what it was. The look of a man who found, periodically, that the woman he was married to said things that rearranged something in him that he hadn't known needed rearranging. When did you get so practical about feelings? He said. I've always been practical about them, Evelyn said. Feelings are just information. You work better when you have the right information. He almost laughed. It was the closest she had seen him come to it. A full, unconstructed laugh. And then it happened. He laughed. Short, real, the sound of a man who hadn't heard himself do it in a while and was a little surprised by it. She smiled. She didn't try to keep it off her face. The Morrison family came back in June. This was the piece of the settlement Evelyn had not quite let herself believe until she saw it. The return provisions covered 3 families whose land had been acquired under the same manipulative pattern. The Morrisons, the Aldriches, and the widow Henley's daughter, Clara, who had accepted a below-value sale on the Henley parcel 4 years ago when her mother's debts had made keeping the land seem impossible. The settlement's administrator had worked out fair value compensation for each, and the Morrison and Aldrich families had chosen to return to their land rather than take cash. The first morning the Morrisons were back on their property, Pete Morrison drove over to the Whitaker Ranch and knocked on the door. He was a compact man in his late 40s who looked like someone who had been through something and was still taking stock of what was left. Caleb opened the door. Pete looked at him for a moment. I owe you something, Pete said, for whatever you did that got this moving. My wife did most of the moving, Caleb said, and stood back from the door. Come in. Pete Morrison sat at the Whitaker kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with Caleb and Evelyn for most of an hour. He talked about what the past 3 years had looked like. The sale he hadn't wanted to make, the loss of the work he'd built over 20 years, the way his family had come apart at the edges under the weight of displacement and uncertainty. He talked about it the way men like Pete Morrison talked about things they had survived. Not to generate sympathy, but to put it somewhere outside himself, to set it down in a room with other people who would acknowledge it had been real. Evelyn listened. She did not offer interpretations or lessons. She poured more coffee when his cup was empty. When Pete left, he shook Caleb's hand at the door and then turned to Evelyn. He held his hand out to her. I heard about you, he said, before you came. When the agency advertised, people talked. They talked about it the way people talk about things they think they already understand. He paused. I was wrong about what I thought I understood. Evelyn shook his hand. So were most people, she said. It's all right. It's not, really, Pete said, but I appreciate you saying so. After he drove away, Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. That was more from Pete Morrison than I've heard him say in 10 years combined, he said. People talk when they've been through something and survived it, Evelyn said. It needs to go somewhere. She went back to the kitchen. She was thinking about Pete Morrison's face when he had talked about his family coming apart at the edges, and she was thinking about her own journey here. The 11 days of travel, the $42, the letter she had read 3 times, the moment she had stood on a frozen platform and heard herself described as a burden through an open window. She thought about the version of herself who had stood there, holding a single bag, hands shaking. She thought about what that woman had done next, not what she had accomplished, the deed, the spring, the settlement, the South pasture beginning its slow recovery. Those things were real, and she was not going to diminish them by pretending they were small. But what she was thinking about was the simpler, harder thing. The decision to walk through the door of the post office when walking away would have been justifiable. The decision to stay on the land when the land seemed to be conspiring with everything else to reject her. The decision to keep doing the next thing when the result of the previous thing was unclear. There was a version of strength that people talked about as though it arrived all at once. A great heave of courage, a single definitive moment. She had never experienced strength that way. She had experienced it as repetition, as doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the thing after that, on days when the outcome was uncertain, and the welcome was thin, and the cold was real. That was the version of strength she had, and it was not glamorous, and she was glad she'd had it. The Sullivan boy, whose name was James and who was 22, not 20 or 21, as Caleb had slightly underestimated, came to work at the Whitaker Ranch in the second week of June. He arrived with a bedroll and a very small amount of personal property, and the guarded quality of someone who had learned not to assume anything was permanent until it had proven itself over time. He was good with cattle in the instinctive way that Caleb was, the way that came from having grown up among them rather than from having studied them. On his second day, he did something that needed doing in the barn without being asked. Orrin noticed it and said nothing. But at supper, when they ate together as they had developed the habit of doing, Orrin said, to no one in particular, "James knows how to read what needs doing." It was the most direct endorsement Orrin was likely to give, and everyone at the table understood that. James Sullivan looked at his plate with the expression of someone who was unaccustomed to being spoken well of and was taking a moment to process it. Evelyn offered him more biscuits. He took them. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of the ranch expanded to accommodate 3 hands and the larger herd and the new work of the South pasture recovery, which was in full operation now under Mercer's written guidance. The days were long in the summer way that made Montana feel like somewhere that had decided, for these few months, to give something back after the severity of the winter. Evelyn worked. She had not stopped working since September and did not intend to, but the quality of the work had changed. In the first months, it had been urgent in the way that all crisis work is urgent, the particular high-wire feeling of doing something that has to be done now or the opportunity is gone. The work now was different. It was building work, the slower and in some ways harder work of making something that was meant to last rather than simply survive. She was corresponding regularly with the Great Falls buyer now, who had committed to a purchase volume that required them to expand one section of their dried beef operation before autumn. She was corresponding with Mercer about the phased introduction of the drought-resistant feed crops he had recommended, starting with the section of South pasture that had shown the best early recovery. She was corresponding with Bray, who had become something closer to an advisor than an attorney since the settlement, and who occasionally sent her articles from agricultural and legal journals that he thought would interest her, with notes in the margins that were more collegial than professional. She realized one evening in July while going over the summer production numbers, no longer just managing a crisis. She was running something. The recognition settled on her strangely. Not with pride exactly. Pride was too clean a word for it. But with the specific satisfaction of a person who has brought their full self to a situation and found that their full self was equal to it. She was not who she had been in Philadelphia. Not entirely. That woman had been capable, certainly. The capability was not new. But the Philadelphia version of herself had been capable in theory, in preparation, in the planning for a life rather than the living of it. The woman sitting at the kitchen table in July, going over production numbers on a ranch she had helped save and was now helping build, was someone who had been tested and had not found herself wanting. She was also, and this was the part she thought about more carefully, more privately, someone who had not expected to be loved. Not in this context, not in this way. She had expected to be useful. She had expected, at best, to be respected. She had come here without illusions about what a mail-order arrangement was and what it generally became, which was a practical partnership between two people who needed things from each other and managed, if they were lucky and worked at it, not to make each other miserable. She had not planned for Caleb. Not the person Caleb actually was, rather than the person she had expected to find when she read the letter 3 times and made her decision. She had expected a man shaped entirely by hardship and pride and the kind of bitterness that failure produces in people who don't know how to separate themselves from what has gone wrong around them. She had found someone more complicated than that. Someone whose pride was real, but whose capacity to revise what he thought he knew was also real, which was rarer. Someone whose hardness was a surface condition rather than what lived underneath it. She had not planned for any of that. She had not planned for the way he stood behind her in rooms where she needed to be in front, or the way he cleaned a cut on her palm with the same attention he gave things he valued, or the way he laughed, which was still rare and therefore still worth something every time it happened. She had not planned for this, and she was not entirely sure yet what to do with it, except what she was already doing, which was to show up every day and let it be what it was becoming. Caleb found her on the north edge one evening in late July, standing at the spring. This was a thing she did occasionally, came out to look at it, not because she needed to check on it, but because it was important to her in a way that was not entirely practical. It was the piece of the property that had been the center of everything, the thing Roy Candler had spent years working to take, and the thing she had spent months working to prove they owned, and she found that she needed, periodically, to stand next to it and confirm that it was still there and still running and still theirs. Caleb came and stood beside her the way he did on the south pasture that March evening, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cooling air. Mercer's second report came in today, she said. He's pleased with the south section. I saw the letter, Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I came out here to talk about. She looked at him. He was looking at the spring, not at her, in the way he sometimes looked at distance when he was working through something that needed care. I've been trying to find the right time to say something, he said. And I've decided that there isn't a right time, there's just time, and I should use it. Evelyn waited. She had learned to wait for him without filling the space. When you arrived, he said, what I said at the post office, I told you I'd been thinking about how to address it, and then I never fully did. I apologized for the way the situation had been described to you, but I didn't. He stopped, rebuilt. I want to tell you what I actually thought, what I actually felt, not to make you feel bad about something that's over, but because I think you deserve to know what changed and why, and that the change is real. She was very still. I looked at you on that platform, he said, and I saw someone I hadn't asked for and didn't think I could afford, and I was angry about the situation, and I let the anger go where it was easiest to let it go, which was toward you. He paused. That's not something I'm proud of. I know what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it. I know because you told me, and because I've thought about it a great deal since. Caleb, let me finish, he said. Not unkindly, she let him finish. What I've come to understand, he said, is that what I saw on that platform was the shape of my own fear. I was afraid this place was going to die and take me with it, and you arrived in the middle of that fear, and I made you part of what I was afraid of instead of seeing you for what you were. He turned to look at her now. What you were was the answer, not to everything, not perfectly, but to enough of it that we're standing here instead of somewhere else, and this land is ours instead of his, and I have more hope for what comes next than I have had in years. He paused. I want you to know that I see that. I see you. Not what I expected, not what I thought I needed. You. The spring ran past them, and the evening air carried the specific smell of July in Montana, dry grass and distance, and the faint mineral edge of the water. And Evelyn Harper, who had learned at a very early age to hold most things carefully and most people at a distance that protected her from the specific pain of being seen incorrectly, stood very still and let herself be seen. I know you do, she said. Her voice was even, just barely. Is that enough? He said. For now. As a start. She looked at him. This man who had cleaned her cuts and driven her to the land office before 7 and stood behind her when she needed to be in front and laughed, once, at the kitchen table in a way that had taken her completely off guard. This man who had written a letter to his own attorney in his own imperfect hand, because it was his family's history and he was going to stand in front of it instead of behind it. This man who was standing at the spring in the July evening asking her if what he had just said was enough. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's a great deal more than enough." He reached over and took her hand. Not the careful, purposeful way he had in the kitchen, over the letter. Just took it, the way you take something that belongs to you. She held on. They stood there until the light was gone and the spring ran on in the dark beside them, the way it had always run and would go on running, indifferent to human drama and faithful to its own nature, which was the only way to be faithful to anything. But the years that followed were not easy. Anyone who tells you a working ranch in Montana becomes easy is selling you something, or has never worked one. There were bad seasons and equipment failures and one outbreak among the herd in the second year that cost them 8 animals and 2 months of work, and a level of sustained anxiety that Evelyn later described to Mercer, in a letter she mostly didn't send, as the closest she had come since the Roy Candler period to genuine despair. They got through it. Not cleanly, not without cost, but through it. James Sullivan turned out to be, as Orrin had assessed in his understated way, someone who knew how to read what needed doing. He became indispensable in the way that certain people become indispensable. Not through grand gestures, but through consistent presence at exactly the point where presence was required. By the third year he was, in every practical sense, the ranch's third partner, though the formal arrangements remained what they were. Caleb raised his wages twice without being asked. James said thank you and went back to work. Orrin watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has made a correct assessment. Orrin himself was still there at the end of the third year, and the fourth, and the fifth. He had turned down at least one other offer that Evelyn knew about, a larger ranch to the north that was paying considerably more, and had said only, when she asked him about it, that he knew this land and that learning new land at his age was more trouble than the money was worth. She had accepted this explanation because it was the one he offered, and because she understood that people's reasons for staying were their own. The South pasture came back. Not in 18 months, exactly. More like 22, which was within what Mercer had called the reasonable range, and what Evelyn had privately called the acceptable range, having learned to hold a slight buffer between what she hoped for and what she planned around. When the first full-growth season produced what the tests had predicted it could produce, she was standing at the fence line with Caleb, both of them looking at something that had been written off and recovered anyway, and she thought about the version of this land that Roy Candler had tried to acquire, the diminished, misrepresented version, the land as he had needed it to appear in order for his scheme to work. And the difference between that version and what she was looking at made something move in her chest that didn't have a clean name. The Great Falls buyer became a long-term relationship. By the fourth year, they were supplying 2 additional buyers, one in Billings and one through a contact Mercer had provided, in a distribution network that reached into markets Evelyn had identified from reading trade publications with the same focused attention she brought to everything that might matter. She was, by any reasonable assessment, running a business. She understood this. She did not need to say it out loud to know it was true, and she had reached a point where she did not need other people to say it out loud either, which was its own kind of arrival. What she had not expected, even after all of it, was the particular moment in the 5th year when Caleb came back from a regional agricultural meeting in Billings, the first year he had attended, having resisted the previous 4 on the grounds that he didn't have time for meetings when he had a ranch to run, and told her that 3 men had asked about the Whitaker operations methods. "Asked how?" she said. "Asked what we're doing differently," he said, "with the pasture recovery, with the feed crop integration. There's a family in the Yellowstone Valley that's dealing with the same compaction issues we had, and they'd heard something about what we'd worked out." He paused. "I told them about Mercer, and I told them about the testing protocols you developed." Evelyn looked at him. "You told them about the testing protocols?" "I told them exactly where the approach came from," he said. "I told them my wife developed the testing schedule based on Mercer's methodology and our specific soil composition, and that if they wrote to us, we'd share what we'd learned." She was quiet for a moment. "How many families did you say this to?" she said. 3 at the meeting," he said, "and 1 more on the road back." He met her eyes. "Was that wrong?" "No," she said. "No, that wasn't wrong." She looked at the table for a moment. "It's just, I hadn't thought about it going in that direction." "What direction?" "Outward," she said. I've been thinking about this ranch, about what we were building here. I hadn't thought about what it might mean to other people. She paused. People who are where we were. Caleb sat down across from her. The lamp was between them. It was always the lamp between them, and they had been having their most important conversations in this particular light for 5 years now. And she thought sometimes that the lamp would outlast both of them and go on burning on the table between two empty chairs, faithfully illuminating whatever came after. I've been thinking about that, he said, about other families. He was quiet for a moment. About what it would have meant to us to have had what you brought to this ranch earlier. If we'd had someone who understood the records, the legal documents, the land science, someone who knew how to look at what we had and see what it actually was instead of what we were afraid it was. Evelyn looked at him. Are you suggesting something? She said. I don't know exactly what I'm suggesting, he said, but I think what you know, what you've learned here, and what you knew when you arrived, is worth more than this ranch getting the benefit of it alone. He paused. Mercer writes. He publishes what he learns. He shares the science because science is only useful if it moves. You think I should write, she said. I think you should write, he said, or speak, or something. I don't know what the form is. But I know that 3 men at a meeting in Billings asked about what we'd done, and I know that whatever you tell them is going to be more useful than anything I can put in a letter. Evelyn sat with this for a long moment. There was a version of her. Not the current version, but the version who had arrived at the Harlan Crossing platform in the cold, with $42 and a travel bag and hands that would not stop shaking, who would have deflected this, who would have said she was practical, not theoretical, that what she knew worked on this land and might not translate, that she was not in a position to tell other people anything. That version of her had been through too much now to still be doing that. Write to Mercer, she said. Tell him what you told me, and tell him I want to ask him what the right approach looks like. She paused. If I'm going to do something, I want to do it correctly, not just send letters to people who ask. Caleb looked at her with the expression that had been, over 5 years, the most constant thing about him. That particular look of someone who is watching a person be exactly who they are and finding that it still surprises him, in the best way, even after all this time. All right, he said. All right, she said, their word, still. The letter she eventually wrote, with Mercer's guidance and Bray's advice on the practical and legal dimensions, and with Caleb reading every draft and changing the parts that sounded like she was trying to sound like someone other than herself, went to 12 families in 3 territories. She had found their situations through Mercer's network, through the regional meeting contacts Caleb had come back from Billings with, and through 2 women who wrote to her after a notice appeared in an agricultural journal Mercer had helped her get published in. The notice was 4 paragraphs. It described, without naming names or specific locations, the situation a ranch could find itself in when the legal documentation of its land value was incomplete or inaccurate, and it outlined the steps that could be taken to address that situation. It mentioned water rights specifically. It mentioned the importance of the original survey documentation. It mentioned the 1891 ruling that superseded the 1887 case, the one Roy Candler's attorney had been counting on people not knowing about. She got 14 responses. 14 families in various stages of the same thing she had walked into on a frozen Montana morning with a travel bag and $42. Some of them worse. Some of them earlier, still with time. She answered every letter personally. This took most of a winter. She did it at the kitchen table, in the lamplight, with Caleb sometimes across from her doing his own correspondence and sometimes just present, which was its own kind of help. She could not fix every situation. She was honest about that in her replies. Some of what she had done required specific local conditions, a specific document, a specific attorney willing to work on modified terms, a banking commission that had been watching for a pattern. She could not promise those things transferred. What she could do was tell them what she knew. What she could do was point them toward Bray, who had agreed to correspond with anyone she referred. What she could do was tell them the 1891 ruling existed and what it said, because a piece of information that protected someone's home was only useful if that someone had it. 7 of the 14 families had outcomes that moved toward resolution. Not all 7 resolved the way hers had. 3 settled at terms that were less favorable than what she had obtained. 1 lost their land despite everything. 1 was still in process when she had last written. But 7 families were in a better situation than they would have been. 7 situations had turned because someone had known what to look for. She sat with that number sometimes and tried to decide how to hold it, whether the 7 was enough, or whether the 7 should have been 14, or whether the number itself was the wrong thing to be measuring. She had concluded eventually that the number was not the point. The point was that the information existed, and it moved, and some of it reached people in time. That was what information was supposed to do. Orrin retired in the 7th year. He did not call it retirement. He said he was going to stay in the area, but stop doing the early mornings, and that James could handle what needed handling. He came by the ranch on a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, not any particular occasion, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the property in the detailed, specific way of a man who had known a piece of land for a long time and was making his peace with loving it from a slight distance. When he left, he shook Caleb's hand at the door. He looked at Evelyn. "You did well," he said. She had received a great many assessments over her life in both directions. She received this one without deflecting it. "So did you," she said. He nodded once and walked to his horse, and she watched him go with the specific feeling of someone watching the end of one version of something that would continue in another form. James hired his younger brother the following spring. Between the 2 Sullivan brothers and the occasional help of a neighbor's son during the heavy seasons, the ranch ran with the functional competence of something that had become what it was supposed to be. What Evelyn thought about, in the quiet years when the crisis had resolved into life and the life had settled into something she had not quite dared imagine when she stood on that frozen platform, what she thought about was not the victory. The victory had been real, and she was not going to pretend it hadn't mattered. But victories were moments. What came after was the thing you actually lived in, and what came after for her was this. A kitchen table with a lamp. A man across from it who had, over years, become the person she had glimpsed that first month underneath everything else he showed the world. A spring on the north edge of the property that ran without interruption through every season, as it had always run, correctly described now in the records that would outlast all of them. A south pasture that had come back from the dead, as things sometimes do when you give them what they need and enough time. 14 letters. 7 families. 1 attorney in Helena, who had taken a case on modified terms because the evidence warranted it. 1 scientist in Billings who had driven out to look at the ground because someone had asked him the right questions. 1 old ranch hand who had walked a woman through the south pasture on her second morning and shown her what the land was actually doing instead of what it looked like it was doing. This was what she thought about, in the way you think about the architecture of something after you have been living in it long enough to understand what holds it up. Not the dramatic moments, though the dramatic moments had been real, but the daily accumulation of people doing what they could with what they had. She had come to understand that this was how most important things happened, not in the single definitive moment, not in the one great act of courage that changed everything, but in the repeated decision to stay, to show up, to do the next thing. She had made that decision so many times that she had stopped counting them individually. They had become, simply, who she was. She had also come to understand something about being judged before you are seen, which was the experience that had defined most of her life before Montana. She did not think the people who had done that were mostly evil or mostly cruel. She thought they were mostly afraid, in the way that people are afraid of things they don't know how to measure, which is what she had been to them, something they didn't know how to measure and so had measured wrong. What she wanted, when she thought about the families who had written to her, was not for them to be impressive, not for them to prove something. She wanted for them what she had had here, which was time. Time and enough information to know what they had. Time and someone willing to stand beside them while they figured out what to do with it. That was not a small thing. That was actually almost everything. Caleb came in from the evening check as the sun was going down, the same as he had every evening for 7 years, and took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door that had always been his hook. He looked at her at the table. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You're thinking in a particular way." He sat across from her. The lamp was between them, as it always was. "What is it?" She thought about how to say it, about Pete Morrison's face when he talked about his family coming apart at the edges, about the woman she had been on the platform, hands shaking, hearing herself described as a burden through an open window, and the decision she had made in the next 30 seconds that had led to every other decision since. "I was thinking about what things cost," she said. "Not money, the other kinds of cost. She paused. And what they're worth. Caleb looked at her in the lamplight. He had lines in his face now that hadn't been there when she arrived. She supposed she did too. They had worked hard years, and hard years left their mark. And she had decided somewhere along the way that marks were evidence of having been present for something real. Is it worth it? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She looked at the man across the table from her, this imperfect, complicated, better-than-expected man who had learned to see her and had not stopped, who had stood behind her when she needed it, and beside her when that was what was needed, and occasionally, in his best moments, in front of her when something needed facing that she did not need to face alone. Yes, she said. Simple. No decoration. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, the spring on the north edge of the Whitaker Ranch ran on in the dark, the way it had always run and would go on running, faithful to its own nature, which was the only way to be faithful to anything, and more than enough.